everybody, we're back. Had a nice, well, I didn't have a nice lunch, but they all did. I go watch the talk that they gave regarding NASA's plans for commercial space, creating a commercial space economy. They called it both the supply and the demand. And the talk was from Doug Comstock. He was the deputy chief financial officer for integration and HEOMD or HEOMD commercial LEO liaison, a typical government title, but he's in working with NASA's efforts to get both an economy started in space, which I think is kind of cool. They want to make available things that are already in the ISS and things that NASA is already doing with private industry, where people even like you and me can pay for things like being able to put up an instrument on the ISS for a certain fee, and they're working out what would that fee be and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff going on that I didn't know about within NASA on this regard, and they've got a long-term plan like NASA does for just about everything that does. There's a slight hum of the audio, but anyway, I'll sort that out. I'm getting ready to go with the live stream soon anyway. It's probably coming from the camera, and I may need to turn off and back on the mic. So I'll do that in just a sec. Is it still there? Slight hum noise. Is it slight or is it like really distracting? Anyway, I'll try to sort it out before. I think I turned the mic level up while I was recording that speech over lunch. So I'll play with the mic levels here in just a minute. A lot of details here with stuff like this. So anywho, sorry about that. Okay, it's getting started back up again. Sorry about that glare. All right, here we go.
Usually that is that enviable spot that everybody craves, but I've got a great panel here that's going to keep you engaged for the entire time. And I'm going to turn it over to Marty Frederick, who has been on my planning team and has been a very vocal member of my planning team. And we finally got to meet today, so I'm going to turn it over. Marty, Corporate Director for Northrop Grumman, and I'll let you do the introductions from there. Thank you.
All right. Is this thing on yet? It is. Okay. Thanks, Chris, and it has been a pleasure to be on the planning committee this year. It's been a lot of fun, really good group, worked very hard. So I am Marty Frederick. I'm a Corporate Director for Civil Space Programs with Northrop Grumman Corporation. I work in our Falls Church corporate office. My boss is interested in space policy, and as Admiral Ellis would say, that makes me absolutely fascinated in it. So I'm really glad to be here. I've got three esteemed panelists. You probably see in your program that we had four. We're going to be deviating a little bit. Mike Bevan, Senior Policy Advisor with the National Space Council, he's had to wave off and to address some important activities back in DC. So he sends his regrets, and we'll miss him being here. But the show must go on, and we have some agile panelists ready to handle the change. So let's see here. So when the Symposium Planning Committee was considering the agenda, we looked at the topic of space policy as broad and interesting topic, so broad and interesting in topic that we felt we needed two panels to cover it. The one panel before lunch was the FACA panel, very much tied up into the policy aspects of it and how policymakers and others are getting their information and how the dialogue is being shaped. So that's all very important in the space realm these days. This panel is intended to look at space policy drivers. The current policy formation environment in Washington, D.C. is, in a word, non-intuitive. We'll say that this panel is going to focus on the challenges associated with this unique environment coupled with the diverse perspectives across the national security, military, civil, commercial, international space domains. On the current state of space policy, I look to National Space Council Executive Director Dr. Scott Pace. He's publicly stated the current administration's policy is actually very simple. Bigger, higher, farther, faster, now. So with that as the lead-in, I'm going to turn this over to, we're going to start at the other end and work our way back. So Eric, if you can lead off for us. Eric is the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. CSF is the largest trade organization dedicated to promoting the development of commercial spaceflight, pursuing ever higher levels of safety, and sharing best practices throughout the industry. CSF has worked tirelessly to develop industry standards and craft the modern Commercial Space Launch Act and encourage further growth in the commercial spaceflight industry. Before his position at CSF, Eric served as Vice President of Government Relations at Analytical Graphics Inc., AGI, and he came to AGI from the Space Transportation Association, and he also worked on Capitol Hill in the office of then Congressman Tom Coburn. And Eric, could you lead us off?
Make sure I'm hot and everyone in the back can hear me. I asked that once at a speech I was giving if everyone in the room can hear me, and a couple of people in the back raised their hand and said they couldn't, so everyone in the front went to the back. So I always got to be a little leery of that. And there was a reference to Jeff Faust and the great work that he does in quoting us in real time. So I was wondering if Jeff Faust is here and if I'm going to get quoted in real time. And if he's not, then the floodgates are open of just free-flowing conversation. It's a privilege and an honor to be here, and I thank Chris and the organizing committee to have us here. I think there's so much going on in Washington in the realm of space policy, and so much that has been going on in the last few years. It's kind of hard to keep up with everything. The last panel, Mike Gold, who is always entertaining to listen to, and you can even learn something every once in a while from him. He had a fun picture, just titled FACA Fun on all these advisory committees. And it's really been a great honor for me to serve on a few of these on the ComStack and also the user advisory group with Mary Lynn. We've become kind of a road show together, like Astaire, Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. We don't do any dancing, but we're always together. So it's been great, and I think we're learning a lot from our different constituencies, and what we're really realizing is that we have a lot more in common than we have, kind of opposing. So that's been a great thing, and it's great to be here with Doug, who there was just a great job opening in Washington as of yesterday for the National Security Advisor. So I'm sure Doug's probably right in line as they go down the list. Really one of the most qualified people, and it's a short-term gig, so just keep it in mind. Again, Faust isn't here, so that would be one that would get me there. As I said, there's been so much going on in the space policy world, and a lot of it's been driven. I'm not saying all, but a lot of it's been driven by the engaged enthusiasm of the White House, the president, especially with the Space Council, on these space policy directives. One of the ones, and there's so much for us to talk about today, and I don't want to get bogged down in anything, but one of the ones that we really got engaged in and really involved, and I think it really energized the community, was this recent NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that came out of the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. And this really became quite a third rail in our community, and not an exciting third rail, as long as you don't get, it gets electrocuted. But the rules that kind of govern or legislate space launch haven't really been updated in over 20, 25 years. So as we took this closer look and a deeper dive into these proposed rulemaking changes, it really got quite a bit of folks from all aspects of industry engaged and involved, and which is a great thing. So it was a lot of dialogue between the companies and between certainly the FAA, who was at the forefront of this. And it really kind of highlighted the beauty of sausage that most everyone loves sausage. Of course, though, you don't like to watch it being made. But, we were really at the outset at the factory floor of making the sausage, and the dialogue that went into this. This rulemaking, it started off with an ARC, this Aviation Rulemaking Committee, and how these rules should be looked at. Our organization was really looking at updating these the rules regarding the launch side of the house, and also how it regulates spaceports. And then, the dialogue as this quiet period, as the FAA really really put their shoulder to it to get these rules out, these proposed rules in a short amount of time. I think less than a year. Actually, it's about 10 months to get that out, and then to receive all the comments from industry. Some positive, some negative. Here's what you got right. Here's what we think you missed the mark on. And then the process of the dialogue on how they interact with industry. So, at times, as we should be, we were a little critical of it. We thought there were some shortcomings, and we voiced that through the appropriate channels. And I think we're seeing headway, and I see that in a lot of areas. I see that in the Department of Commerce and the efforts that they're having in reforming the remote sensing rules, as well as with NASA. As NASA's moving forward this very bold vision, how do we achieve this vision in a cost-effective way and a really efficient way? So and getting everyone involved with this excitement. So I'm going to leave it at that, and we can talk a little bit more. But those are some of the hot button issues that we've been dealing with, and I think makes for an exciting time to be in space policy.
All right, well, thank you, Eric. That's excellent. Let's turn to Doug Lavero. Mr. Lavero is a highly regarded senior DoD space thinker and leader. He most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy before forming the Lavero Consulting Corporation, LLC. Mm-hmm. And
one person.
so in this role in space policy, he was responsible for establishing policy and guidance to assure United States and allied warfighters the benefits of space capabilities, and helped guide the department's strategy for addressing space-related issues. He also led the departmental activities in international space cooperation. Prior to that, Mr. Lavero served as the Executive Director of the Air Force Space Command's Space and Missile Systems Center, where he also served as the Air Force's Deputy Program Executive Officer for Space, overseeing every major DoD space effort. In addition to the assignments above, he's also directly managed multiple DoD national reconnaissance space programs, such as US GPS, US Future Space Imagery Architecture Program. He left the government in 2017. He has a long list of awards and accomplishments and degrees, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks so much, Marty. You didn't tell me we were supposed to come with our stand-up routine, so
Yeah,
Eric
you
obviously
needed us all
prepared,
10 minutes.
and I did not.
Keep up with
So I apologize for that. I missed the FACA panel, so I missed the Mike Gold show. So
Always a
I'm
pleasure.
really,
Is
I'm
Mike
really
here?
upset about that. Let me jump right into some things about a policy that I really think we should talk about today, and hopefully we get a lot of questions today, because I think that's going to be the most important and interesting part. But Marty began the discussion here talking about three kinds of policy. He talked about national security policy, he talked about commercial space policy, and he talked about civil policy. And Marty, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but as if they're three different things.
Yeah.
And to me, they are not three different things. They are one thing in the same. They may be three sides of the same three-sided coin, which I have yet to find, but they are one and the same thing. They go hand in hand. I often remind people, in the U.S. we don't have something that is called maritime defense policy, and then maritime commercial policy, and maritime civil policy. It's all maritime policy, and it's built, of course, on hundreds and thousands of years of tradition on the sea. Similarly, in the air, we have decades and decades of policy. On space, we've never really attacked this as a unified whole, save at the national level when the president issues his space policy and tries to put all three of them together in one policy. The first U.S. national space policy was actually written by President Eisenhower back in 1958, and encapsulated these three sides of the policy debate, but all in one policy to try to show that they were coordinated. over time they became less and less coordinated as different forces pushed decisions that were regulatory in nature, as Eric just talked about, or national security in nature, and we forgot that they are a unified whole. They really do complement one another, and let me illustrate that point for you by telling you a story that happened to me 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the UN invited me over to a conference in Geneva to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty. And the Outer Space Treaty, if we really look at it from back in 1967, is really the fundamental policy that guides almost everything we do in space. Whenever we pass U.S. national law, we always have to be cognizant of the treaty commitments that we sign, because under U.S. law, treaty commitments trump national law. And so we have to always recognize that. And I was at this conference in the UN, and all the conferees were congratulating themselves on 50 years of peaceful space and pointing to the treaty as the thing that created 50 years of peace in space. When it was my turn to get up after a day and a half listening to the Russian delegation and the Chinese delegation and all the other delegations on this, I said, you know, we haven't had 50 years of peace in space because of a outer space treaty. In fact, we've had 50 years of a contest in space that's included national security. None of us have found it in our interest to go ahead and actually do harm to one another in space. It's not because a treaty prevented it. If that were true, there would have never been a war in the past 1,000 years. But I also chided them because they were still celebrating what they did 50 years ago, and they hadn't done much since in terms of national policy. And yet the entire state of play of space had changed. The policy in '67 was basically written by three countries, the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK, and the UK was really there to go ahead and add some legitimacy to what the two other countries were doing. Eventually signed on, of course, by hundreds of countries, but those folks wrote the rules, and they wrote the rules to be to their advantage. They wrote the rules to allow for warfighting in space. Many people say that the treaty only permits peaceful uses of space. That's absolutely incorrect. It only permits peaceful uses of the moon and other celestial bodies, but all hell can break loose in the spaces between. And that's allowed by the treaty because those two countries were using space for military purposes. But the treaty didn't recognize there's going to be a huge commercial industry that might have commercial interests in space. The treaty didn't recognize that there's going to be more than just 2 or 3 players in space. There's going to be 60, 70, 80 nations playing in space. The treaty didn't recognize that there would be a time in the future where we might want to think about mineral rights on the moon or asteroids as a real thing, as opposed to some imaginary thing in a Jules Verne's novel, which is what it looked like in 1967, but a real economically viable concern that we should care about. And in fact, the only thing the UN wanted to argue about is whether or not they wanted to pass another treaty called the Treaty to Prevent an Arms Race in Outer Space, called PAROS, which they've been arguing about since 1984 and have made no progress on, or the Treaty to Prevent Weapons Placement in Outer Space, the PPWT, by the Russians now introduced, or other treaties that had to do solely with national security uses of space. And my comments to them was the policy vacuum in space, and I don't mean to be rhetorical, but the policy vacuum in space is so much richer and so much more in need of change in the economic and civil realm than it is in the national security realm. That's what we really should be concentrating on as an international and a national community. The conference was either shortly before or shortly after the U.S. Congress passed a mineral ownership rights bill. I think that was back in 2017. Was it 2015?
At the end of 2015.
Yeah, so right after that. So the U.S. had already passed a law that basically said we're not going to go ahead and abide by the treaty, although the Congress, if you read it closely, also told the State Department to go out and negotiate how we could make that law actually legal in an international realm. The State Department failed to do that. And so I was able to yell at our State Department, as well as the State Department of other nations as well, for failing to do what we really need to do, which is we need to go ahead and start to talk about international policy, rules and regulations, norms of behavior that create opportunity for civil and commercial space, and at the same time, just as in maritime law, will serve us well in our national security realm, because these are three interrelated things. We will never be able to reach agreement with the Russians and the Chinese, much less many third world nations, on national security rules for space that are focused solely on national security. We will reach agreement with many nations in the world on things that help us all commercially to go ahead and compete in this vast expanse that we are really at the very edge of entering, called space, and what it will mean for us economically in the future. I went back to the UN 2 years later, which was just this past March. They still hadn't made any progress, which was obvious to me. But I began to talk to some folks about, maybe just a subgroup of us should get together and make progress if the entire world can't. Amazingly, many nations actually want to make some real progress, even if it's outside the auspices of the UN. And I reminded folks at that conference that ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, started out as a non-UN organization with 55 nations. Now, there were more than 55 nations in the world back in 1944. But only 55 had to come together to create the rule set that basically spurred international aviation and all the economic benefits that have occurred and accrued to us because of international aviation. So it's my belief that we need to go ahead and get moving in this regard, that the U.S. should lead in this regard, and that we need to start to lay out the rules of behavior for international work in space that are in our economic and civil interest and will serve us well in the national security realm as well. And with that, I'll conclude my opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. Really appreciate it. Let's turn to Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar. So Mary Lynn is the president and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, a diverse industry trade group supporting deep space human exploration, space science, and space commerce. She is a member of the Users Advisory Group of the National Space Council, as we heard earlier. She serves on the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee for the FAA, and is a member of the Executive Committee of the Space Studies Board of the National Academies. She began her career here at University of Alabama, Huntsville, as a member of the faculty before joining the Boeing Corporation, where she managed the Mission Operations Group for the ISS. And Mary Lynn, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you, Marty. And thank you to the committee for the invitation to be here, and to Marty for the invitation to be here. And it's always a joy to share a panel with esteemed colleagues such as Doug and Eric. And so really appreciate the opportunity to do that. And it's always fun for me to come to this conference because it is sort of coming home. This was my first professional gig out of graduate school. I came and did work both with the College of Engineering and the College of Arts and Sciences here. And when as I was here that Boeing first approached me and asked me to leave academia and join Boeing. And at the time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go join, as I put it at the time, a multinational conglomerate that builds a lot of weapons. But they eventually won me over, actually sort of indirectly. Within about 6 months of being here, I was consulting over at Marshall Space Flight Center. And if over time, about 5 years, I figured I was enjoying doing that work more than I was enjoying the academic work. And so I left and started the first of what eventually became 4 companies because I'm a glutton for punishment. And then eventually ended up as working for Boeing in their Mission Operations Group for Station, which was a wonderful experience and has informed a lot of what's happened since then. A story there briefly for those of you that knew John Young. Captain Young wrote a infamous memo, which Wayne may remember, which actually had to do with space station training and what an utter disaster it was. And John was noted for his memos. They were not short, they were not concise, they were extremely detailed, and there was no doubt whatsoever after you had read one exactly where he stood. And I was at work at Boeing, and Jim Buckley, who had worked for John, actually directly in the astronaut office before Boeing had hired him, came in, thrusts this memo in my face, and says, "Can you do anything about this?" So to this day, I blame John Young for absolutely everything that's happened since then, because I decided to try. I'm not sure if I succeeded, but I did start to try. And I'm still trying. So what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the title of the panel I thought was really interesting, Space Policy Drivers. And I want to talk about some that have already been mentioned here, but also talk a little bit about a couple that haven't. Is Nick still in the room?
No.
Yeah, you're there. Okay, so let me just start by saying this. Congress. Okay, now we're good. All right, so what I want to do is talk about what a lot is getting a lot of the press these days. Okay, is obviously the activity of the administration because it's so deeply engaged in trying to, first of all, develop policies that are more whole of government, and if they're not whole of government, they're at least more of government. To try to look at a lot of the barriers that are exist within agencies and NGOs and other organizations that drive policy in the U.S. government, try to knock those down and figure out where it is that we can leverage capabilities that have already been developed, and then also make changes that need to be made to push the ball down the field, particularly with regard to commercial and civil space, but also national space policies, with Space Force. So there's been a lot of, obviously a tremendous amount of activity. Wayne earlier in the panel on FACAS mentioned that there were a list of directives that came out that were given to, well, essentially not just NASA, okay, but mostly NASA, okay, given to NASA that it was supposed to execute on the last 60 to 90 days. And I refreshed myself as we were sort of going into lunch to remind myself what they were. And they're broad reaching. They go over everything from civil space, like how are you going to go do Artemis? And to commercial space, how are you going to make the best use of that? To international partners, how are you going to make the best use of international partners? And they're really trying to pull on both at the same time. What's interesting about the way they're written, if you go read them, is they're a combination of directive to sort of come up with some sort of NASA's perspective with regard to policy, but also an implementation plan. Not deep, okay, but something of that at the same time. And so they're pretty complicated, and I wish NASA well. 60 to 90 days to do a lot of this work is a tremendous amount of work. It's worth reading. You can go pull them up on the National Space Council site if you want to go see, which is actually over at the Office of Space Commerce. Okay, if you want to see, okay, what those directives are. So fast and furious coming out of the National Space Council. We can tell you as members of the UAG, also, it has looked from the outside as though we haven't been doing a lot, but we have. Eric and I have been co-chairing a committee on economic development and industrial base, and there's 5 other committees. And all of those committees have been meeting and essentially trying to bubble to the surface issues that need work so that we can eventually move forward with recommendations or observations that will sort of be passed back up to the Space Council. So that's all happening, and you'll see a little bit more of that, I think, later in the fall when there'll be another public UAG meeting that hopefully will bring some of that stuff forward. At the same time that the administration is rolling forward with all this thing, we have this co-equal branch of government called Congress, which is on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And because of what I do for a living, I frequently get phone calls from staffers, and I know Eric does too, I'm sure Doug does too, okay, asking me in various ways, what the hell? Okay, sometimes it's gee, could you tell us a little bit more about such and so a thing? At other times it's like, wow, this is great. Can we understand a little more about, kind of how it is that you're seeing it? And in some ways it's like, can you explain this to us? And a lot of those conversations, some of it obviously is driven on a partisan basis. And so we all know that, we're a sophisticated audience. Okay, we're aware of that. But some of that is really, I think, my own view is that Congress is reacting to the fact that it has a tremendously activist administration. And it's still trying to get its hands around that. Okay, what does that actually mean insofar as formulation of policy is concerned? In civil space, Congress had a path that they thought that everybody was on, okay, which was eventually going to yield maybe boots on the ground by about 2028. Now we're talking about 2024. And oh, by the way, there's all these other things associated with it. And then over here, there's wanting to do more work on commercial remote sensing, which everybody agreed, okay, needed to happen. And so that's one of those areas where things have been pretty well aligned and not so much, there's little stuff that goes back and forth, but everybody agreed that really needed to happen. And there's this push and pull, and that push and pull is historic. The founders created it that way. Okay, there's a push and pull between these co-equal branches of government, but it's very interesting to be in Washington right now, okay, and be watching Congress, okay, react to sort of what's happening from an administration point of view, and have to sort of pick its way through, okay, which of these priorities for the administration do we want to make priorities for us? And obviously that has something to do with the interests of their constituents, but it also has to do with the fact that Congress evolves policy positions over time, right? Which it sort of creates through legislation. And it's a much more, what's the word I want? I will say contemplative, you could say slow, pick your, process. But it's one that does consider policy, I would say, in a more deliberative stance. And so there's this interesting tension that's happening right now beyond all the usual tensions having to do with partisanship, okay, that really have to do with just sort of the speed and the grasp that the administration's taken on policy issues, and then how Congress is trying to deal with those. The last sort of policy driver I want to mention just at a very high level is one that we don't talk about very much, but I do want to talk about it because I really want to lay a couple of things to rest. Social media is the thing that I want to talk about. It's in the public forum. And there is a belief, space advocates, as you all know, have great passions. It's a passionate community. We care about all of this. One thing I really caution people a lot on is that if you read space policy as it gets sort of built up in social media, and to some extent the real media, although I'll be honest with you, I think that with some exceptions, and Jeff Faust, we should probably give him sainthood after the number of times he's been mentioned here in the last, okay, but anyway, Jeff and some others, okay, who are really responsible journalists, okay, kudos to them, right? Because it's hard to do this job and do it objectively and do it in a way that's very thorough. Irene, who did a masterful job yesterday tweeting out the fire, okay, in Japan, okay, that sort of now has postponed a cargo shipment up to the ISS. A lot of these people who are just do really great jobs. I want to be clear that I'm not throwing stones at anyone, but I go up on the Hill and I hear this from staffers, and I haven't asked Eric this question, but I'm sure they do too. Staffers are getting younger and younger, which is another way of saying I'm getting older and older, okay? Because it's pretty much really the same age that they've always been, but they're coming in and they're reading social media. A lot of them getting their news, okay, from social media. And they're reading outlets that have not traditionally been associated with space, that have ventured into space because it's become very popular, what with SpaceX and Blue and others, okay? And so they're reading a lot of that stuff and they're getting their news from that. And we at the Coalition actually started a class for staffers, okay, which we started last year. Actually, Wayne came in and gave a lecture, Dan Dumbacher came in and gave a lecture, where we were just basically getting people who are established experts in the community. Dan came in and talked about program management, systems engineering. Okay, Wayne came in and talked about his work in commercial space. Okay, we had people come in who are established leaders in the community to basically sit down and talk to these young people, okay, largely, all right, for an hour and a half, and then do Q&A. And the Q&A is probably the best part of this. And the reason that we started doing it was because I kept getting questions that were clearly based on what somebody had read in social media. So I would like to encourage everybody here to get educated on what the actual facts are. What Eric said earlier about we've got a lot more in common than we do separately, there obviously is going to be competition in the industry. That's just a given, right? I mean, that's actually, in my view, one of the things that's wonderful about the American system. Okay, so there's obviously going to be that, but become educated about the facts and do not hesitate to share those facts. Because there is such noise, okay, in social media. And when it reaches the point where it's beginning to influence young staffers on the Hill, and no, I'm not talking about Nick, okay, when he was there, okay, but others, all right, but others, so it begins to be problematic, right? And so I don't know that social media is actually driving space policy at this point, but it is driving a perception that it's driving space policy. And from that, it starts to get easier to just sort of roll right over that. So it's just one that I want to raise, okay? I'm not sure if it's actually a driver yet. It's a question that I have, but it's one that we've been concerned about, that we started to try to essentially start a class, okay, to try to deal with some of that stuff. So I'll stop.
Can I give you a ripped from the headlines
Sure.
that is driving social media that I had to deal with on August 20th? An article titled, "The government's plan to update rocket launch licensing is pissing off the commercial space industry." The Verge. So you can imagine some phone calls that I got from that being the commercial industry.
It's your fault.
That is my fault.
Yes.
And although everything that I said was, we're working very closely with AST on this, and we're trying, everyone's coming together on these rules. It is pissing off the commercial industry. You don't get that in the Washington Post as much, or Space News, but online, where a lot of people get their news, those are some of the headlines.
Right.
Good. Very good. All right. Thank you very much, Marilyn. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to use a little bit of moderator's license to ask the first question while everyone else is formulating their questions. I'm not sure we said national space policy directives explicitly, but the White House has put out a few intends to put out a few more. That is part of what the Congress is having to react to, what the industry is needing to react to. And Doug, as I think you pointed out, the international community is probably going to be reacting to that as well. How do you think that using space policy directives as leadership tools in our community is working out in the current environment? And whoever wants to go first, just go ahead and speak up.
I'll jump in because I'm never shy.
Yeah.
I think they're excellent. A space policy directive is nothing more than a decision documented on paper. That's really all it is. But the act of documenting it on paper and publishing it makes all the difference in the world. It is a statement of what the leadership of the nation has decided to do. And to Mary Lynn's point, it then creates a reaction in the other branch of government that has a say in those things. And sometimes those reactions are good, and sometimes those reactions, or I should say, sometimes the reactions are for it, sometimes against it. But regardless of for or against it, it creates a reaction, and reactions create progress. So if you just go ahead and give a speech, if you're a senior executive and you just in the administration, and you just give a speech and you say, here's what I want to do, but it's not committed down to paper, well, then it's just one of a million speeches that have been given. But if at the end of the day you have a presidentially signed directive that says, here's what I'm directing the apparatus of government to go do, the Congress and the other elements of the nation, both the commercial world and the civil world, are forced to react and to take a stance for or against it in support of accomplishing the objective and saying it's not due. And that conversation drives progress in no uncertain terms. And if I look at the four SPDs that the president has signed out, every one of them has driven progress. And I'll share with you, several of them were things we were actively discussing when I was in space policy in the Obama administration. But we were doing those same discussions, the exact same discussions, with many of the exact same goals, were happening in private, not in the public sphere, and therefore create less progress, in my mind. Now, clearly, there's a point to where you can issue so many proclamations that the situation becomes too noisy and you can't really make progress. But that hasn't been the case. We've had 4 space policy directives so far in the first 3 years of this administration, and every one of them has been on a very high level issue that has to do with U.S. competitiveness in space, national security competitiveness, civil competitiveness, commercial competitiveness, and I think it's excellent. So I'm very much in favor of them.
I think, and I agree with everything Doug said. The only challenge is that we live in a very polarizing world, and I have applauded these 4 space policy directives because they're tangible. They are something, and they're marching orders, if you will. But the reception that you get with, an administration that is at times controversial, say it lightly, I guess, and you get these directives that go over to Congress, and folks on the other side know that they're pretty sound, and they read it, but they just don't want to like it because of where it came from, and that impedes the progress a lot of times that I see of educating different various members that just are adamantly opposed to the administration. But we're saying, hey, but this is really good for business. This is something we all, kind of agree on, and to bring them around on it. I think to, Jim Bridenstine, as he was voted in as NASA administrator, very accomplished person, qualified for the job. It's the president's discretion, and he got confirmed by 1 vote. By 1 vote. There's convicted felons that did better than him in the confirmation process. So that just goes to. This is all off the record, right?
I believe Eric said that Jim Bridenstine is worse than a convicted.
See, that's social media. See, Doug is the problem. Don't tweet that out on me. But that's the challenge that we have, and going up and educating. Nick's old office. The Senate Commerce Committee. When we go up there, we make sure that we're briefing the Republicans and the Democratic staffers. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, with so many in the room, you don't know who's who. Who's a Democrat or who's a Republican. And I love that because they want to hear the no nonsense, the unspun version of why this legislation is good or these regulations are good or why they're bad and how they can be helpful. So.
I would say I would agree with absolutely everything that has been said. I would say that the devil is in the details, right? The purpose of the SPDs is to, I like that very much. Essentially, it's a decision that's been put into a presidentially signed memo, basically, is what it is. And then how it is that you go about implementing that, and that's where it starts to get interesting, because that's when Congress starts to get engaged, and the White House is also engaged. OMB is certainly engaged. With regard to, I'll just talk about NASA. With regard to NASA, NASA is certainly engaged. I mean, some of the directives we referenced earlier, where they're having to try to figure out how they're going to execute some of these things by 2024, and then after that from 2024. And so one thing I would like to point out is that when you think about it from a policy point of view, a space policy directive is a directive. It sets direction. It is not intended, okay, to basically necessarily drive out what all the details of the implementation are supposed to be. And sometimes I hear those things get confused, right? Well, it was said to do this by the Space Policy Directive. No, the Space Policy Directive said, okay, that we're going to reinvigorate the human spaceflight program. We're going to go to the moon. We're going to lay the framework to go to Mars. We're going to do that with commercial international partners. Essentially what SPD1 says, okay, we're going to do that in an innovative fashion. Okay, everything that comes after that, all right, is really the implementation plans. It's going to get negotiated back and forth between all these different entities that are engaged. But it's important, I think, to sort of keep those things, understand what one is and what the other is.
Excellent. Chris, I think we've got a few minutes, right? Should we turn it over to the audience? Any questions?
And questions, are the mics on? Yes, good.
Yeah,
Anybody? Oh, there's one up here. I need traveling music.
You do.
Hello. So I guess this question would be for Mrs. Dittmar. In regard to what you were speaking right now, I guess as simple as what are your recommendations for people to, I guess, get educated and informed in space policy, so we don't go to social media and get like juicy headlines.
Okay, so first of all, come to conferences like this, where I think people work really, really hard to try to get information out in front of people and engage conversations that tend to be fact-based rather than, necessarily talking point-driven. There's some of that, but essentially they're trying to get the facts out there. I thought the exploration panel this morning was great. I mean, I love hardware. I miss hardware. I used to actually do hardware, believe it or not. Okay, and so when I see hardware, I get all excited. It was good to sort of see that progress being made. If you read social media right now about SLS and Orion, SLS is a paper rocket. Okay, Orion is too heavy to be lifted by anything ever in the history of humankind.
Right.
And essentially, we're not going to be able to use these vehicles to do anything at the moon. Now, that's obviously one brand of social media that's very extreme, and I'm also being very extreme in terms of how I'm talking about it. But the material is actually out there, okay? I mean, when it comes to commercial remote sensing, for example, if you want to go look at the Office of Space Commerce, there's a huge collection, okay, of data, okay, and previous policy work and drafts, and then there's a lot of that exists in legislation. I mean, part of the problem here is that to become educated requires work. And so you have to actually do the work. And one of the things I fear for the country, the sort of loss of critical thinking that I see whatsoever. People are perfectly willing to sit around and let their televisions or their social media channels serve up to them what it is that they should be thinking about things. Come on, people. Citizenship requires work. Okay, and it's the same way, okay, in space, all right, which is that you have to go do the work. But those sites are out there. Just go Google NASA, Google the Office of Space Commerce, Google the FAA, Google Congress, okay? Find Nick, okay? I mean, find George, okay? I mean, there's a lot of people. This room is full of people who have a tremendous amount of expertise in these areas. You can tune in and listen to ASAP as it's going down. Okay, you can tune into a lot of these deliberative bodies and these FACA by definition. Okay, yeah. You can listen to FACA. Okay, as it's going on, but you do have to do the work.
Could I jump in there? I want to say there's so first of all, I agree with Mary Lynn. You have to do the work. It's critically important. I also think there's something important for us to do, and that's to do outreach. Mm-hmm. So often we are so insular in what we do. We don't do outreach. I write a lot. I come to conferences like this to speak. I but I appear on less scientific shows as well. I was on something called Hotel Mars the other day, a podcast that some of you may listen to. I never heard of it. They desperately wanted me to tell them how the Space Force was going to be Starship Troopers on Mars. I mean, they asked that question like 4 different ways, and I just wouldn't bite on it. But the point is that there is an audience out there that's hooked on social media. I view it just as much as our responsibility to go ahead and get the work out there. Yes, it's all available. You can go and on the websites, but let's face it, the citizens today don't necessarily have the time nor the inclination to do so, and yet we still need an informed citizenry. So I believe that it is one of our responsibilities as those of us who are learned or at least have an inkling of what goes on in this community to share in the way that folks want to learn. And so I almost never turn down a request for an interview, although my wife, who's also my CFO, asks me what I'm getting paid, and the answer is always zero. Nonetheless, I think it's critically important for us to reach out and go on these places which are less likely to have the truth presented and actually inform the audience. And every time I've done that, I get reactions back. It's like, I never knew that. That makes sense. It didn't make sense to me before I listened to what you said, and now it makes sense. And if I can only do that for one person at a time, that's worth it in every way, shape, and form.
That's awesome. I agree.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah, I think that's one thing on the UAG that they've been very much encouraging us to do, is to go out to the different conferences and talk about, in not a propaganda way, but in what we're doing. There's no script, just, how are we involved? How are we moving the ball forward? What are some of the hindrances that we're having with some of these directives, and where they're positive and where they need some work?
Hi. Eric, you touched on this a little bit, but maybe all the panel could talk about this a little more. One of the advantages our industry has had in the past is it has been very nonpartisan. The space support has been very good, broad across the aisle. But are you starting to see that change, like you said, because of the heavy partisanship going on in Washington right now? Is it going to start hurting our industry in that people are going to start taking positions that are more partisan and less friendly towards space in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we always have, as you mentioned, enjoyed a very good bipartisan spirit, and I think on the committees that are relevant to us, the Science Committee, the Commerce Committee, of course, always the Appropriations Committee. Some of these, there's so much turnover in the House and a little bit in the Senate, and it's this constant education process. I testified last month or in July on a hearing that was basically Space 101, and what we should, what are the issues, and what is commercial space, and what do we need to know about it, things like that. And at first I was like, gosh, do we really need to do this? But we do, because there are members of Congress that just aren't educated on the issues, and not to bring too much levity to the table, but one of the ideas was, well, why do we need to do a gateway? Why don't we just tow the space station into a lunar orbit?
Yeah, of course.
And
It's a great idea.
Yeah, so I got these friends in Huntsville that might be able to help on this, but I didn't even know what to say, so I deferred it to Gerst, and later that day he's gone. So
That was your fault too, obviously.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that had nothing to do with the answer. But it's the education process. It's it's the relationships. Everyone chides these special interests in Washington. I'm biased. I think space is a special interest. It's the most special interest. And I think we need to get the message out on what we're doing, on the vision. That's not just this administration, but I think it's a national vision on what we should be doing. I think I saw a statistic on one of those on social media. Like, do you agree with going to the moon in 5 years? It was like 83% agree that we should go to the moon. Yeah. So but it's hard. There's 435 members of Congress in the House that of that, maybe 35 to 40 really care about space and maybe are educated, and just probably 10% of the Senate, maybe a little bit more. So, but the work goes on for sure.
I actually find that even in these days of hyperpartisanship, space and both national security space, civil space, commercial space, still tend to be mostly nonpartisan issues. And I'll point to perhaps the most partisan space issue that we're dealing with right now, or the one that has the potential to be most partisan that we're dealing with right now, which is the creation of the Space Force, which the president directed. And even in an issue that is so visceral and has so much negative press about the militarization of space, a Democratic House voted basically for the entire bill the administration put forward. The Senate, I would comment, did not, and in fact, they're the ones who have to get back in line here. But that demonstrates the lack of partisanship and the more trying to do what's right. On that particular issue, I've spent the last 3 years working with both sides of the aisle, both houses of Congress. It well before the president mentioned it, and after the president mentioned it, and I found no particular change in the positions of the individuals on the subject, from before the president mentioned it and after the president mentioned it. So I still find that there are areas like this, like space, that are nonpartisans, and I think, again, one of our responsibilities is to make sure space doesn't become partisan, is to make sure we don't try to appeal to one side of the aisle to gain advantage, either industrial advantage or programmatic advantage or whatever kind of advantages, that we don't do that, because the minute we start making decisions about space partisan, they will become so. We instead need to go ahead and appeal to the higher angels and say this is the right thing for the nation, and carry through, and then explain why it is the right thing for the nation. So again, I believe that's on us to go ahead and do.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not seeing much of a change over time. I do think we have to treat that bipartisanship tenderly and with great care, and understand that it's a tremendous asset to us as a community, and take the kinds of cautions that are being described here. What I see more, at least on the congressional end, is a generational change. And I referenced it a little bit when I was talking about staff, sort of unfairly. I mean, I'm hoping some of my friends here will take some of that understanding how I meant it. But that's true also of members, right? We had a lot of members who came up through the Apollo generation, and they sort of imprinted on Apollo. And so for them, some of this appears as self-evident in some ways, right? That the United States needs to remain engaged in space. But as you have younger and younger members coming on board, they don't have those memories. They didn't have that experience. And so reminding ourselves that we need to continue to articulate things that may seem self-evident to us, but are not self-evident to people that are outside what I'll just call the bubble. I think that that's something that we also need to take very seriously, and be certain that we continue to refresh that with policy influencers. That means people at think tanks as well as the media, okay, and then also those people who are actually building the policy. And I think we just need to remind ourselves over and over and over again how important that is.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for all of your comments. But picking up on the social media dimension, and since this is space, why don't we fight fire with fire, is the context of the question, which is using Hangouts, which is a social media context, of course, virtual panel like this, that can reach far further than an in-person panel, and be more enduring to address some of these challenging topic areas, and areas where the community could be underinformed, like, say, nuclear thermal propulsion. What are your thoughts on that approach to try to get the word out more equitably?
So I think Hangouts are great. I think because they allow for discussion and interaction in some ways that are different than like a 240 character tweet, right? Or even a tweet storm. Okay, that's still. But there is so much noise. From a communications point of view, my doctorate had to do with a thing called theory of signal detection, and I won't bore you to death, but part of it had to do with signal and noise, right? How salient is the signal and how much is the noise? And there's a tremendous amount of noise. There's more noise each and every day because there are more and more channels each and every day. So my view is the way to deal with that is, first of all, to really count on people who understand communications, who practice it for a living, and to engage them and continue to work with them in doing that kind of thing. But also make a use of all available channels. So Hangouts, okay, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, you all know what they are, but to the extent that we can kind of consolidate our messaging, right? Which is one thing I think the SPDs also could be used for. They have really sort of said, here's what we're on in the middle of the road. These are the issues, or these are things that are high priority. Consolidating our messages sort of around all of that stuff and making sure that we keep pushing that through all of those channels. It's a tough job, and it's very difficult to do to rise above that noise level. But I don't think we can stop, right? I think we have to continue trying to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the areas we have to do is get out of our own echo chamber. As I say, like in my world, my friends are space people. I hang out with space people. I talk, I go on panels with space people, and I think space is the best. And I got a hard, wet sock to the face this past couple of years ago, or about 2 years ago. I think on or about February 6th of 2018 with the Falcon Heavy launch. And that was eye-opening, not because it was a great, technological achievement or the advancements by a private sector company, about how it's going to impact or the impact that it had on the national airspace and the integration into the airspace. And the aviation community, who I just didn't give a whole lot of thought to. I mean, they got me here. Hopefully they'll get me back. But they took off the gloves.
Yeah.
When it was a shuttle, no problem. Close all the airspace. When a national security payload, we have no problem. But you have a billionaire putting out his Tesla as this stunt, to test this technology. We've had it. And they really took off the gloves with us. And for the past 2 years, that has been my fight with the aviation community. And it's gotten better because it took a lot of communication. But, they have profits in mind, and we are impacting on their profits. And I'm just saying space, like everyone that launches. We launched 32 times. We had 32 commercial launches in 2018. Down in Florida, they're shooting 50 for, they're going 50 for 50 or something like that. And it's only going to grow, and they're concerned about that. So we have to get this message out because, you get headlines, another, rip from the headlines. The next time your flight is delayed, blame Elon Musk. Thank you, Bloomberg, for that. And so they're getting the message out as well. So we have to tell a positive story, the impacts that space has, the positive impacts that it has. But getting out of, just talking to other space people.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add much to this. You talked about doing panels like this on Hangouts and other live stream kind of things, which several organizations do. John Logston, who got the award over lunch, GW often does those kind of live interactions things. I will tell you, I'm just an old curmudgeon on this, but I believe there's I know, no way. But I believe there's so much noise in the system. It's maybe not worth trying to do that as a main means of communication. For one thing, look, the fact of the matter is that 75% of the country barely cares what we talk about in this room, and and they don't vote for their legislators on issues we're going to talk about in this room. So it really doesn't impact us all that much. I find every time I do something online, the number of people who misunderstand what we're talking about are far outnumber by 10 to 20 to 1 the people who understand what we're talking about. And in fact, the stream of comments that come after that have far more negative consequence on the message than what I originally posted or originally may have said. And so I fear that danger. What I do love, and I want to pick up on what Eric said, we do need to be showmen a little bit to go ahead and get our message out. Elon Musk, for better or for worse, is a showman, and more people watched, Ziggy Stardust flying the Tesla around, and started to learn about orbitology and the fact that the Tesla has finally made its way around the sun one time, and it's got the best gas mileage of any car ever invented in the history of mankind. That kind of showmanship actually works in social media.
Yep.
Where you can teach in a way that attracts eyeballs and doesn't attract trolling. And I think that's the key. And by the way, I think NASA, of all of the agencies that do space, the NRO tends to not be very socially media active. I don't know why. The president posted one of their pictures. I don't know why. I think that the fact of the matter is that there actually is some good social media interactions where you can adopt a positive tone and teach people things that actually expand our bubble of individuals, and I think that's to the benefit. I would hate to try to do something where we have a whole bunch of interaction back and forth. I find an exceptional amount of trolling on the Space Force kind of topics, which I deal with a lot. There's probably a lot of trolling elsewhere, so I do fear that reaction.
But so just to bring that full circle, when I said I think you have to use all the channels, I do mean all the channels. I mean the written word. I mean, you need to, people do actually put stuff on social media that reflects decent content because they've gone and found that content. So the written word, things that get published in online, things that are really quality kinds of things, using all media. But I do think you also have to be, to your points, I think you have to be very realistic about reach. The polling data have not changed in 60 years in this country, not in 60 years, okay, with regard to the amount of interest among the public, okay, with regard to space. They haven't changed. They've been remarkably just rock solid stable. It's a minimum, okay, of people that are engaged enough to sort of keep this whole thing going. And I think Musk is a great showman, and I think that we actually have him to thank to some degree for the fact that there's all this sort of renewed interest in it. But I do think that we have to keep on doing that communication and that engagement. We have to think about all those different channels that are available to us.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
But we got Michael back in the office, and he's texting me about. So.
Okay, good. Perfect. Well,
Thank you very much, and thank you for Marty for assembling a great panel.
no, thank you for everybody's attention. This is great. Thank you so much.
All right, space policy coming up. That was cool about the Hangouts. Did you guys see that? I know there's still a hum. I'm still plugged in. I just had to put my head in. They're switching up to the next thing. Next thing up is Moon to Mars. So that's going to be a cool panel. That starts as soon as I get set up, I think, and it should go until about 4 o'clock, where there'll be a break. And then I'm told I get to talk with somebody from Northrop Grumman, and I'm going to ask about JWST. So that was pretty cool, though, wasn't it? Did you hear them talk about the Hangouts? And they didn't mention me because they're talking about Hangouts in general, but Ron Burke, the guy who asked the initial question, I work with him, and he helps me set up the Future in Space Hangouts. So he was, asking about getting those as an avenue for getting the word out. So he's very supportive. So anyway, we'll get back to the thing. Oh, well, they're still switching around. So, but that was really cool. I thought that they talked about that. So let's see. Yeah, Elon Musk. I know people love him, man, but he gets on my nerves. He just gets on my nerves. He's like, I get it. He's got a lot of fans. He's got a lot of people loving him and loving SpaceX and what they're doing. But that's why he's doing it. He's generating hype for SpaceX and Tesla and all the other things that he's doing. But I don't know. Sometimes it's extremely counterintuitive. The hum is gone. No way. How can it be gone? I didn't do anything different. Oh well, not going to complain because like I said, I need this. I like to keep the camera plugged in if I can. I didn't think it was around earlier in the morning, but maybe you guys didn't have it up enough. I don't know. Anyway, I'm just using this directional shotgun mic on the top of the camera. So yeah, it's good to have support, and people are very supportive here at AAS. They really like what we're doing. The problem is getting people together to do decent hangouts and wrangling. It's like herding cats, getting all these people into the same area at the same time. But you know, I mean, we get there. Harley was the one that set this up most of the time in the past, and while you know he tended to go with people he knew, and he knew everybody, and a lot of them were from NASA. He didn't really go outside into the AAS membership. Okay, they're coming back. So let me get this back.
We're not going to force these guys to cut it off any earlier because there's a lot to talk about. But I'm going to introduce my friend Marshall Smith, who is at NASA headquarters, responsible for mission planning for a lot of different things, and has always been the model for the 3-day beard. And I think that's always been great for you, Marshall. So I'm going to leave it to you, and you can introduce the rest of your panel.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, what I think I'll do is I'll first go through the panel here and just introduce real quick who we have here. As Chris said, I am actually the director of Human Lunar Exploration Program. So what we're doing, a lot of what we're doing from Moon to Mars and moving on is in this area that I'm working. So I will moderate this panel, and when we get to the end, I'm sure we won't have any questions about what's going on. So anyway, to my left here, immediately left, is Dan Hartman. He is from Johnson Space Flight Center. He is the Gateway Program Manager. And Dan is obviously as the program manager, managing the development of Gateway and overseeing the power propulsion element, the PPE, the HALO, which is the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, which is a small habitation volume that we're going to use to dock to when the lander gets up there, as well as Orion and the logistics element. And of course, the Gateway Logistics element services as well. So he's handling that. To his left is Lisa Watson Morgan, and she is from Marshall Space Flight Center, and she is the Human Landing System Program Manager. She's been on board, 2-3 months now? It's been a wild ride so far. And she's been running at full speed, collaborating with U.S. industry and working within the government to get a human landing system out and on contract. That's our number one task right now. And we're working to develop, integrate, and conduct crew tests of this human landing system by 2024. And then to her left is Lindsay Aitchison. Lindsay is from NASA headquarters. She is the EVA strategy lead for advanced exploration systems. Lindsay is the spacesuit. She's my spacesuit expert. So I turn anything comes up with spacesuits, I ask Lindsay. So Lindsay is the spacesuit and EVA expert at HQ, and she is coordinating the development, acquisition, and evolution strategy for the XEMU spacesuit, which she'll talk about when she has a few minutes. And then finally, at the end, last but not least, is Michelle Rucker. She is from Johnson Space Flight Center. She is leading the Mars Integration Group. And what she's doing is looking at how we're going to go to Mars holistically. You know, what is our Mars architecture strategy, working our studies, analyzing key trades, and how we leverage and anticipate to make investments into the human missions to Mars, really focusing in on a 2030s type of time frame is where we're going. So with that, I think that's all the folks that we have today, and I will go ahead. Let's go to the next, please. We have a few slides, and each of us only have a couple slides. Next. One more. Okay, great. So what I wanted to do is just show a slide, just a general overview of what the plan that we're working to. For Artemis Phase 1, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo, the goddess of the moon, and that is the name of how the systems that we're taking to get to the moon in 2024 and on the lunar surface. So Artemis 1 is formerly known as EM1. For those of you who've been coming to these meetings, we've talked about EM1. There's no change there. It is the first human spacecraft to go to the moon in the 21st century. And we will be conducting a distant retrograde orbit type mission, and then coming back from that complicated mission where we're uncrewed, and then recovering the vehicle. That'll be the first test flight, and then crewed test flight. For Artemis 2, we will be sending the first humans into orbit. First, we'll do a highly elliptical orbit. It's actually the same mission as EM2. Do a highly elliptical orbit where we'll check out the ECLSS systems and other crewed systems, and then once we're confident after that 24-hour period, we'll select to go to the moon, do a lunar flyby, and return. At that point, the vehicle will be ready to be used for crewed missions out at the cislunar area. The first Artemis support mission will go up. It'll be a solar electric propulsion system called the PPE that Dan's program will launch. That's in December of 2022. It has a 1-year demo period where we'll be taking data on the solar electric propulsion system because that's a key technology to enable us to go to Mars. And then following that, the second Artemis support mission will go up. It'll be the first pressurized module to be delivered. That's called the HALO, which again is under the Gateway, it's part of the Gateway. Followed by a logistics element that will be launched that will carry surface logistics that will need to go to the surface of the moon. The next major component will be from Lisa's program, the human landing system, which will be delivered to the Gateway. It'll be multiple launches we expect, but we're in the process of getting proposals on those, and we'll see how those come out. And then finally, we'll launch an SLS with an Orion to the Gateway, which will already be docked with the and we'll dock to the Gateway where we'll have the HLS and the logistics waiting for the crew. They'll board the system. They'll get any logistics out they need to go down. 2 of the crew will go down to the surface of the moon, conduct EVAs, collect science, those types of things, and come back. And then they'll return home in the Orion. So that's the first mission. In the meantime, science and STMD will be playing a huge role in helping us enable these missions. First of all, we have Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or CLPS we call it. They'll be launching 2 to 3 missions per year starting in 2020. These will be small payloads that will be taking scientific instruments and other capabilities and to learn information about the South Pole and other parts of the moon. We'll be doing those throughout this period. Also, science is looking, and CLPS is looking at a large-scale cargo lander, which could deliver something like a rover or a large experiment that we would want to have much higher mass potential than say on the normal CLPS type of systems. So those also will be done. That's looking at a 23 time frame leading up to the 24 mission with humans on the moon. So that's the whole Artemis Phase 1 approach. Next. So with that, I just wanted to show you an image overall of the vehicle. Now this is the PPE you see in the back there with the solar array wings producing power for the HALO for the system. The HALO is the center component. I'll let Dan talk about those 2 components. The logistics element is on the left that comes up to supply the system, and then that's the concept that we have for the design reference for the landing system right now, with an ascent element, then a descent element, and a transfer vehicle to get to low lunar orbit. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan, and Dan's going to say a few words.
Okay. Mics are hot, or I don't get a green light. Good to go. Mary Lynn mentioned earlier, it's nice to see hardware and be around hardware, and I can tell you the PPE and both the HALO have production moving. Okay, so this is real. We got contracts in place, and real hardware is being built. As Marshall mentioned, we selected Maxar for the PPE element in May, and really what that does is makes use of a commercial bus that they have a lot of familiarity with a 1300 bus, and so it is going to be based off of that. Marshall, we mentioned, is launch in late 2022, and so we're still on track for that, we believe. There are some integration things when you try to marry a commercial bus into an integrated spacecraft. There will be some changes, and we're starting to work through those with the Glenn Research Center, who's managing this activity, and Maxar. It will do a 1-year checkout. We may play into that time a little bit if we need some schedule margin to keep it on the ground. I think there's plenty of time to do the checkout of the advanced solar electric propulsion systems, get the arrays out, get the system in decent shape, and get it into the NRHO orbit. And so we're looking forward to that. These arrays provide 60 kW of power, which is pretty significant. That's about 50% of what we have on the ISS. And this is a much smaller spacecraft. And so we think we're going to be fine from a power generation aspect. Obviously, when you do the solar electric propulsion burns, that does take power away. But in general, we think there's going to be plenty of power to distribute across the different components of the Gateway, and also fly payloads and take care of payloads. Our intent right now is to launch 2 payloads attached to the outside of the PPE when it goes up. And I think we just had a selection meeting, or our selection criteria and the candidate payloads that will be taken up early on. And so we're trying to make headway in the utilization of Gateway as well. One other unique thing about this is we are setting it up for it to be refuelable, both from the aft end of the power and propulsion element as well as the front end through the halo structure going into the forward end of the PPE. The Europeans are very interested in launching a refueler, and so we think we can maintain PPE with the hydrazine and the xenon to keep it up and active for a very long time. And I guess I should have said next chart. It's just another picture of the PPE more specifically. Again, based off of the 1300 bus, you can see the antenna systems. It comes with primed and redundant command and control antennas, X-band, Ka-band, and some S-band. We'll probably add another S-band onto the PPE here shortly. Next chart should be Halo. It's kind of the outline there. You can see it over there as well. Northrop Grumman is off building developing that module for us. It is highly leveraged off of the Cygnus spacecraft that we use to do the cargo resupply missions to the ISS. We will add an extra bay to it. I think the Cygnus today is a 3-bay. We'll add one more bay to get more room in there for the astronauts. And we need to, you can see the axial or the radial docking ports. And also you see that lander is actually pretty big. Of course, the real concepts will be coming. And so we think we need to get as much clearance away from the solar arrays and move those docking ports forward. And so by doing that, we needed to add an extra bay to the configuration. And so we have that in work presently with Northrop Grumman. As I mentioned, outfitted with 2 radial and 2 axial docking ports. It is really the hub of the Gateway. All power distribution, all the avionics, all the software, command and control. I guess, you know, when I what do they call it? The command post. Gateway's a command post on orbit for around the moon is really associated with that Halo module. It will be the brains of the outfit as we're mechanizing it right now. Launch in late 23. We're still working with Northrop Grumman on that on a commercial rocket. And what happens, you have the PP up there already positioned. The Halo module comes in and does an automated rendezvous, proximity operations, and docking directly into the PPE. That transfers the power, that gets the data systems up and going. In fact, every vehicle coming into the Gateway will do this automated rendezvous and docking system. I'll mention a little bit later about the potential to retrieve payloads off the end of with the Canadarm3, but that won't come up for a few more years after we do this. We also plan to launch a metric ton of cargo inside. So that extra bay gives us room inside this vehicle. We have the up mass to take cargo and part of that cargo will be pressurized payloads inside. We also plan to make sure we supply the 2024 Boots on the Moon mission. If it's food and water, if we can offload some supplies from even inside a lander system or even off the Orion vehicle, anything we can get up there that helps the overall up mass to be successful for that 2024 mission, we're going to try to take advantage of. And potentially even if the EVA suits are ready to go early, we could get, I think we'll have the volume, it'll be close on the mass, but we think we can get the suits up in that time period as well. And then, like I said, we'll have payloads inside and on the outside that will operate off of the Halo module, and they will fly up, integrated and installed. So the next chart is our logistics, and this is really for all things, I'll say moon related, for Gateway, for lander, just taking care of the needs of the mission. And that's the needs of the crew, that's the needs of the research on the surface of the moon. We're going to, like I said earlier, we'll probably put the suits in this logistics module. We'll hold it on the ground as long as we can, right up until the Orion mission, so we can add late cargo into that vehicle as needed. We think that's a good game plan to go down, and so that's the path we're on. 3.4 metric ton of pressurized cargo, metric ton of external cargo. First mission in 2024. And like I said, this is out for solicitation right now, so I don't think I'll get into any more details, but we're looking forward to have this capability up and running as well. And eventually, it'll be very CRS based like we do on the ISS. And at the end of a logistics service mission, it'll be our trash disposal capabilities. So we'll fill it full of trash, remove the vehicle, and we'll bring up another one. So that's it for the first three elements that we plan to bring up. That's right.
Thanks, Lisa.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan. So I'm really excited to be here today. Really excited to be part of this panel. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but right before our panel started, we did have the Artemis Human Landing System stand-up come in. So just like everything with this program, we are just in time. I mean, we run right to the end, and we get it there right before we need to. And I will say that, you know, for folks who have been monitoring our broad agency announcement, we are working feverishly to try to get updates, to listen to industry, to make sure that we are working collectively and as collaboratively as we can in this endeavor. So as you know, HLS is charged with something very special. We are charged with putting 2 U.S. astronauts on the South Pole of the moon, which is a really big deal, especially coming off the heels of Apollo 11 and all of the fanfare from the summer. It has just been really overwhelming and exciting, you know, to start up this program. I would say another unique aspect is that we're going to land the first woman and the next man. And that has also generated a tremendous amount of excitement and media interest into what we're doing. And I don't know if I mentioned earlier, I think somebody did, maybe Marshall did, yeah. We have to do this by 2024. And, you know, that's easy, right? We'll be just in time, just like getting all the props that we need here. I mean, all kidding aside, this is a really, it's a critical procurement for the agency. We are going to be doing this differently, though, and I think having the space policy driver discussion right before this panel was, you know, very serendipitous, because wrapping our heads around our approach for this program, it's so different than anything we've worked on, certainly in my 30-year career. Typically, as I think most of you know, the government designs things. That's what we do. That's what NASA does. We come up with designs and government reference designs. We make sure designs close. We make sure the engineering is solid. We make sure we have margins. We do that preliminary work ahead of time, and it takes a long time to do that. Then after that, we hand over the design to the contractor community, at which time they typically implement, we iterate, things like that. Industry, for the most part, has been used to cost plus type contracts. So human landing system and everything really that you're hearing here in this panel today is truly taking a different approach. We are listening to the administration. We are trying to be as forward-leaning as we can in making this more of a commercial endeavor. Our goals are to try to leverage the speed and the operating model of private industry, of best practices that they have, along with how NASA performs safety, understands crew, and has a rich heritage of design, development, test, and operations. So getting those two cultures together, I'm sure there'll be no problems at all, right? Yeah, okay. I'm glad you're still awake. So that's good. And so another interesting facet about how we're going to operate, we're not gonna, as you may know, DD-250. So we're not going to take ownership of the integrated lander systems. We're going to rely on, that's just another way of how how we have a higher reliance on commercial partnering. So the diagram, next chart. My diagram, how about that? And so my only diagram, actually, because as I was mentioning earlier, we are in that iteration standpoint or phase, I guess, where we have requirements. We have 27 right now performance requirements that the HLS is designing to tell industry, here's what we want you to do. Now, as you know, NASA has a rich heritage of, as I mentioned earlier, knowing how to do things, having done them for years and done them successfully. So the how portion, which I would call our design and construction standards, our safety, and our health and medical assets or facets of what we're doing, that is what we're using, I guess, in our new commercial approach here. We're working back and forth with industry after the first, in our first 3 months, to try to negotiate down to the best set of those. And after that end of 3 months, then that's what we're going to be going forward with and executing. So what I have in front of you is a concept, and it's just an operational concept. It is not necessarily what is going to happen, because as you've heard me say, we're waiting to see what industry provides us. But of course, being good stewards, the government does have to do a government reference design and see if it's feasible and can close and all the stuff I mentioned earlier. And this is a representation of that. And since this is an end-to-end commercial solution, we do anticipate industry providing the commercial launch services as well. So a commercial launch vehicle, they will have to acquire that. They will have to integrate their spacecrafts, whether it's 1, 2, 3 stages, whatever their concept is. They will launch those to up towards Gateway. They will aggregate, they will dock. If needed, then they will dock to the Gateway. And after they dock to the Gateway, then it's very important for us to make sure that it checks out. So we're launching this obviously without crew. That's what you've heard so far. So how does crew get there? Well, as you can see over here, you know, the SLS Orion, that is a big job, and that is something that we are leaving, you know, for the government industry team to do, getting the crew up to the Gateway. And once we check out, the crew gets there, that's when we get to do the magic that HLS is going to get to do. So we're going to take 2 crew down to the South Pole. We are going to take materials, you know, materials that are going to be needed. They're going to go down to the lunar surface, perform operations right now, 4 to 6 days, and we're still working towards what the right answer is there. We will perform EVAs, which, you know, Lindsay will talk to you a little bit more and about that. Then they will return to the Gateway, and that will be the end of our first mission. We do anticipate selecting more than one company, which I also think is very exciting. You know, taking a note from Commercial Crew and having a few actually in competition, I think is a good way for the government to get the best bang for the buck there. So our plan is to try to get as many, you know, as we can afford, and then we will have a down select to have 2, most likely, at which we'll run to see who gets there first. I know I'd want to be the first to get there. So we're excited to see what industry proposes. We are looking forward to creativity, not necessarily what, you know, the government design. The government design is great, don't get me wrong. But if we wanted our design, we would have just handed it over. And so we're really interested in hearing what solutions you have that are unique, that are different, and that will help us make the goal of getting to 2024. Because as you heard from the last panel, I think I wrote it down, bigger, higher, farther, faster, now. I thought that was very interesting. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Lindsay wants this.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Lindsay?
All right direction, excellent. So, for those who may not know, NASA has actually been investing in a very methodical manner how we're going to do exploration spacesuit development for about the past decade. So there's been a lot of work that we've done. We're taking the lessons learned from the ISS program, but also looking forward to the future of exploration. This is something that's somewhat nebulous. Your requirements evolve as your missions mature. And so really when we think about this, you look at our portable life support system, we started investing with industry very early on for some of those key components, new technologies that are required for both continuous CO2 removal, a really robust thermal loop system, as well as new regulators that can provide basically infinite number of set points within our band of operation. And so we really honed those specific component technologies, and then we're able to integrate them into a system and really focus on system performance. How do all these new technologies work together to inform a better system design? From there, we went to our first package system. And so again, it's a very methodical approach, trying to take something from the size of basically our office down to the first packaged portable life support system and getting even smaller so we can meet the needs of exploration. Similarly, when you look at the pressure garment subsystem, we're talking about really improving your capabilities, enhancing performance by looking at the mobility features you have in the suit, as well as how well it fits our entire crew population. So focusing on those design elements, we come through to a system that really optimizes the mass that it takes to get that added mobility, but also the size and packaging of the system as a whole into what we now call our exploration EMU. And that's what we're going forward with for our exploration programs. It's a very flexible architecture, meaning that while the first few iterations will be absolutely optimized for the lunar surface, we have very well-defined physical and functional interfaces between all parts of our system, so it can be easily modified to support any mission that we have going forward, whether it's at the gateway or all the way to the surface of Mars. We really wanted to have a system that would evolve. So diving in just a little bit more specifically on the portable life support system, you can see that idea in that we have a motherboard system design. So we have a backplate, that's our titanium backplate to, again, focus on mass savings. But we have all of our fluid lines embedded into that, and it's a single layer architecture. That way, if you need to access any component, you can do that very easily and very quickly. And you can also swap components out, whether it's because it's a failure or a better technology has come online, you can swap it in without having to redesign the entire system. Other things that we've done is we've actually moved some of the PLIS components into the pressurized volume of your suit. That helps you save a lot in terms of structure that you would have had otherwise inside your backpack. You move that inside and take up some of that dead space in the suit. It's optimizing the system for volume overall. Another big lesson learned is we now have a very small display and control unit on the front of the suit as opposed to the large, very mechanical driven one that you've had in the past. And that makes it both easier to reprogram the suit as needed on the fly, but also makes it much easier to fit a wider variety of crew members. On the pressure garment side, it may not look like we've done a lot of major evolutions if you look at the history of our prototypes, but this is the XEMU prototype. Things that are really particularly important on this is we now have a rear entry suit design. Rear entry is very important because it helps not only get greater mobility in your upper body, but it also reduces the risks of injuries to the shoulders that we've seen in some of our other programs. We're really focusing on increasing performance and increasing safety of the system. We've done over 30 MBL runs, so in the pool, testing out that design, learning what works, what doesn't, what's helping your performance, what's hurting. So we've made a lot of progress and really iterated on this design, so now we have a very mature system overall. The XEMU actually just completed its PDR design, and so we're moving into DVT testing in 2020. We'll be sending up our entire thermal loop for testing on the ISS, followed by a full suit demonstration in 23, and be ready for the Artemis demonstration in 2024.
So let's change coordinate systems now. So the entirety of human spaceflight has revolved around the Earth up till now. But to get to Mars, we have to think about revolving around the sun. So it's a little bit different. To get to Mars, first we have to chase Mars around the sun. And then Earth isn't where we left it. So then we have to chase Earth to get back home again. So it's a completely different type of mission than the missions either to low Earth orbit or to the moon. To be honest, Mars is difficult if you try to start from scratch. But we don't need to start from scratch. And that's an idea that goes all the way back to von Braun. So 2 weeks after we landed on the moon the first time, he was already proposing essentially supersizing the Apollo systems and going to Mars. He was ready to go to Mars in 1969. We're going a little bit further. Since 1969, we've got a lot of different tools in the toolbox now. So for example, we've got the heavy lift capability in development, so that's good. I can take advantage of that to help us get our cargo to Mars. We've got Orion almost ready to fly its first mission, so that's going to get the crew back and forth between Earth and Earth orbit. We've got the commercial capabilities in development, so we can get
cargo resupply, refueling. So all those things we essentially get a kickstart on for an eventual Mars program. The Gateway program is going to offer us some solar electric propulsion. That's a technology that is in the trade space for going to Mars. So it's essentially, Dan calls it the Gateway. I call it my prototype deep space transport. He's going to do some in-space assembly a little bit further away from low Earth orbit, so it's a little bit more difficult. He's going to be in a deep space environment with the radiation environment. It's a little bit more hostile, so we'll take advantage of that. When we get ready to build our Mars systems, Gateway offers a pretty nice stable orbit for us to stage our testing from. We've got the ISS. We'll do as much as we can on ISS. The advanced life support systems are already being tested on ISS. We're looking at crew analogs, where we bring crew home from ISS and put them through the first sorts of activities that they would do if they just landed on Mars, just to understand the health and human responses for a long duration space flight, and then landing and having to immediately get up and go do some serious tasks. The Space Communications Network is already in place. We probably need to look at where there's gaps to get us to Mars and back, and fill those gaps in where we can. And then, of course, we're going to have the spacesuits. The current spacesuit that we fly in ISS is for microgravity. It's not really designed for the dusty environments and for gravity. So Lindsay's going to get us halfway there with the lunar suit, and then we'll do a little bit of upgrade and we'll be ready for Mars. And then, of course, the HLS system will give us crew landers. We're already eyeballing Lisa's ascent system. To ascend from the lunar surface to Gateway is not all that different than trying to ascend from the Mars surface up to a deep space transport that might be at 5 Sol Mars orbit. If we can use a common cabin, just change out the propulsion systems, we maybe get a head start on that. And then, of course, all the surface systems. Whatever we need on the surface, the habitation, the rovers, things like that, we'll take advantage of. I always like to say that lunar landers coming and going from the Gateway will look operationally very similar to Mars landers coming and going from the deep space transport. So we'll be able to practice all of our operations at the Gateway using HLS systems. When we get ready to build our prototype deep space transport, we can take it out to Gateway. We can have lunar landers even dock to it. To do end-to-end testing. We can't do that on Earth. There's really no better place to do that than at Gateway. And then, of course, a lot of the systems, some of the systems will be virtually identical. We'll just roll the dash number. Maybe it's a little bit more certification testing for a little bit different environment, but we're hoping as much as possible that the designers that are building these systems for the moon kind of have a Mars forward look in mind, and we can easily recertify those for Mars later.
Great, thank you. So we left ample time because we figured there might be a few questions. If not, I've got some prepared. So, and maybe we'll get the lights to stay on too. Worried about that. Let's see. So let's see. Do we have any questions out there? We'll get a mic to you. And
okay, we have a problem in that most of the questions have come from the other side. So we need some of you guys up here to ask some questions.
oh, we
Got one way up in the back, making me work for it.
So I know that you showed your Artemis and Gateway and lander going down. What's the timeline for the rovers to be landing?
Yeah, so we've been looking at where we're going after phase 1. We would like to, obviously, if we're going to go to Mars in the 2030s time frame, we've got to talk about, assets that we might want to put there. So we're probably talking late 20s time frame is where we would be. That's an option that we're looking at. Those are all in study, and we're thinking about what that actual detail is. Right now, we're at the point where what we've rolled out in our current budget is that we're talking about some kind of surface asset, which may be a rover, it may be a HAB. We haven't decided yet.
So this is kind of an integrated Gateway lander question. With the the highly elliptical Gateway orbit, so the idea is to have a 3-stage lander, to adjust the orbit, to be able to then have the propulsive descent with the descent stage and the ascent stage. Have you thought about adjusting that the Gateway orbit when the crews are on board to minimize the amount of elliptical orbit to kind of make that job a little bit easier?
Yeah, we actually have. We've actually done some analysis. We've done a lot of analysis. The Gateway orbit, the Halo orbit, wasn't something that just came up overnight. We've been having people study Gateway type systems. We call this one Gateway, but von Braun even had a concept of some kind of orbiting facility around the moon or spacecraft around the moon. And we've been looking at these for quite a while. There are always trades with how you go down this path. You've got trades of the FOMs that you want to have and how you want to divide your delta V. It takes X amount of delta V and that's it to go from one place to the other. And so when we looked at, say, for example, a 24-hour orbit, something very, very easy and a little bit lower and would do exactly what you're talking about, the trades that you lost is we lost a lot of launch availability. So because of the orbital dynamics and mechanics of the system, because we have a Block 1 SLS. So we ended up with that trade not being, the launch availability was basically unacceptable. It would not allow us to do the mission. So we actually backed off of that. And that's just an example of one of the orbits that we've looked at. We've looked at a lot of different orbits, though, and this seems to fit the right ballpark for the figures of merit that we have in our studies.
Any other questions up here?
Hi, I'm Tiffany from Marshall. I know the 2024 date for Boots on the Moon. What's the date, if there is one, for Boots on Mars?
So the 2030s have long been NASA's goal. Ultimately, it depends on what the policy and national priorities are. We just implement policy. We don't set policy. So just as with the Boots on the Moon by 2024, the Space Council made a recommendation. The Vice President set the policy, and off we're going. So we expect at some point something like that would happen for Mars. We'd get marching orders, and we will do what we can to meet those marching orders.
A question on International Space Station, getting all the parts working together, working all the interfaces was an extraordinary challenge. Y'all are approaching this sort of in a similar fashion, with partnering with commercials and so forth. So I was just wondering, what thoughts are y'all giving into how you're going to get all these pieces from different vendors and so forth actually working together?
Great question. I think I sounded like, I can't see Dale, but it sounded like Dale's voice. Yes, and he was right in the middle of this on the ISS, as was I, quite honestly. And we ended up with a thing called MEIT at KSC, which allowed you to do multi-element flight-to-flight testing. If that lines up, which is not for certain, well, we'd love to do it. But in the interim, we know we're going to need docking checkout tools, right? So docking verification tools, both the active side and the passive side. We've done that on ISS. With the nodes already up there, and here comes SpaceX on demonstration mission number 1. It has a docking system, and it worked perfectly successful. So it can be done. But you got to lay out your verification plan. You got to have, like you said, Dale, you got to have great ICDs. You got to have good verification tools, and you got to make sure people communicate. So docking, that's basically your mechanical interfaces. We plan to have an avionics and software test facility centered around the Halo module that will go off and talk to PPE, go off and talk to the avionics and the HLS, Orion if we need to. Not quite sure there's going to be an avionics interface there and software interface exchange, certainly with the logistics module. So these things won't see each other like they lined up at KSC for the ISS. I remember being in the SSPF down there, and I think we had 8 or 9 different flight elements. And unfortunately, this was after the Columbia accident, but that did give us an opportunity to stitch a bunch of components and truss segments and modules together in an end-to-end fashion. You just basically, you didn't mate them, you ran umbilicals between them. If it allows, we'll try to go do that. Obviously, that means bringing, to a centralized location, so that has its logistics issues associated with that as well. But in the end, I would be very surprised if we don't do flight-like to flight-like testing before each one of these elements flew. It'll be probably at a component level versus integrated 2 pieces of hardware from a spacecraft seeing each other.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, Dale, just from the human standpoint of that, our 2 program offices are starting, regular discussions in addition to our boards, starting to get together and tackle some of the same issues, so I know you were talking more of the hardware down the road, but to do that hardware down the road, you have to kind of set up what we're doing now and the relationships to make sure we're communicating as best as we can now in the early stages.
And I'll just add on to that a little bit. Both of you guys said this. We really are looking, one of the reasons we changed our approach, originally when we were on the 28 plan, we were going to buy all these components, get them individually. We were going to be the integrator, kind of very much more of a traditional approach. We changed our approach to the Appendix H approach, which is we're buying an integrated lander, integrated services, integrated launch. It's all done by one prime vendor, or really multiple contracts if we want multiple suppliers. But that solves a big part of that problem for the lander. Now, what Dan's pulling on is, we've got to dock these landers, different companies, to a Halo that was made by a company, to a PPE that was made by a different company. And so the approach he's pulling on, and the thing that he said that I really want to pull on, is collaboration is key. Collaboration, just like in the government, we are collaborating very heavily. We are looking for vendors who want to collaborate with us and work very closely with us in the extreme. That's the only way this is going to happen by the time frame we have, is that we work together as a team to make these hard decisions and hard choices as we move forward, and do them quickly.
Yeah, hi, Dan Masnick, NASA Langley. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the international possibilities in terms of our international partners. We've got ESA providing the service module on Orion. We've got the Canada arm, but maybe some of the other possibilities that.
Sure, I can run down them. So Canada, just like you mentioned, Canada Arm 3, we're making provisions to go launch. They'll probably be ready in the 25-26 time period. We're making provisions on one of our logistics contracts to allow that arm to be placed on the outside and launched. They're also providing we call them in space station PDGFs. They now call them LPGFs, I believe. And that's to allow the arm to basically do the slinky walk around effect on the gateway as we need to for either science reasons, inspections reasons, or to do ORUs. So Canada, they'll also have some hardware that's going to fly in the PPE. We're going to fly a couple payloads up on a robotic device that Canada provides to allow, again, swap out of payloads. So they're early on. So Canada's early on. ESA is obviously they're highly invested in the IHAB, and they're working that in concert with JAXA, the habitation module that we will see as part of the phase 2. They're also very interested in the refueler that I mentioned. I've seen some of the early numbers on, I'll say momentum management on the vehicle. The need for refueling may actually be there, right? So I'm glad we have it at the forward end and at the aft end of the PPE. But these guys will have their ESA is proposing to build in a refueler that can go attached to one of the ports on the Halo module and then take care of at least a one-time refueling need for us. JAXA, like I mentioned, is participating in the IHAB with ESA, and they are also planning to develop the HTVX, which is a derivative off of what they fly today to the ISS. It basically changed from a berthing mechanism to a docking mechanism, upgrade some of their systems. The first 2 of those will fly to the ISS, and the remaining ones they're proposing to fly to HTVX. To the Gateway. And then the Russians, again, it's kind of timely because I was in Japan all last week. I'm still feeling that jet lag with all the program managers that want to participate in Gateway. And so this is kind of the theme, the discussions of the hardware components that they want to provide. And then the Russians are still very interested in the airlock. And so, in my mind, to really have a sustainable lunar presence, the habitation module is going to be required, and an airlock to be able to do EVA to fix things is going to be required. We're also talking with the Russians about making that airlock also a science airlock. We have seen a lot of value out of the science airlock on the ISS and the GEM module. It's used more than we ever thought at the start, and so we think that will fold in, and we're trying to make that a common EVA science airlock design. All these international partners have work to do with their governments, just like we have work to do with our governments in 1.6 billion in 2020, right? So not everything's firmed up on their side. They're at different phases of where they're going through their ministerial conferences. Some are as early as November, some are in the February, March time period. And we're trying to wrap all these agreements around. We had in the ISS the intergovernmental agreements. And so we are going to be using the evolution clause that allows us to operate all of our participation, all of our legalese, all that. It's basically a treaty style document that will be in place with the international partners. We're right now in the process of building the individual memorandums of agreement with these individual participants. And of course, this is where you get into the hard stuff of, well, this is what I'm going to provide, right? So I'm going to provide an IHAB, and what do I get in return? Of course, you know what they want to do as far as getting in return. They want to jump in Lisa's module and go down to the surface, or at least go to the gateway. So those are a lot of discussions that are still out there in front of us. I would say much higher than our level probably at this table. But yeah, it's been, I mean, that's why they do it, right? That's why they participate in ISS. They like to get crew members up there, get the research done, somewhat show the flag. And I see that being very, very similar to how they play on Gateway in the lander program.
So I'll ask Lisa, how are we incorporating internationals on HLS? What's the approach?
So for the 2024 mission, we are not incorporating international partners.
Now that we have our contracts in respect to that are, we have a domestic sourcing clause in the contract, so 50% will have to be U.S. at least. It's up to the industry to go decide if they want to go get structures from somebody or some sensors or systems. That's up to them. It's all on them, and they have to tanks, whatever. They have to do that. But it is not our design. It is not our design to go do that initially. The other part of that equation, as far as internationals go, is surface systems, HABs, rovers. Scientific experiments we put on the gateway. All of those things are open. We're looking for contributions. We're looking for other countries to come to us and say, we really want to do this and engage. And then, it's like Dan was talking about, what kind of in-kind trade would there be? Obviously, everybody wants to go to the surface of the lunar gateway. So those are discussions we're having.
Matt McSavany from Marshall. Considering that the HLS procurement model is new to NASA, are there analogs for this procurement model in other sectors of the government? And if so, what kind of V&V strategies have been successful?
What was the last part of the question? What kind of what strategies?
Verification.
Oh, verification validation.
Yes.
Well, so I think, you can look at what we're doing on HLS, and we are doing a lot of, I guess you could look at commercial crew as somewhat of a pathfinder for us on this. Our organizational structure looks very similar. We, met with the NESC, the engineering safety group at NASA, as well as the tech authorities who work commercial crew, brought in some of their best practices of how, what materials did they need. And so that gets into a lot of how we're organizing the contract with our, data products. We're trying to have very few what's called DRDs. We're trying to minimize that. We're trying to make things to where the government has reach back or basically open into the different companies, so we can go pull the data and the information that we need to have insight that will then feed information into like the DVOs, the detailed verification objectives that then will help us lead us to certification and flight readiness. So a little bit from commercial crew, we're trying to lean in a little further. We're trying to, to have access. Those are some of the high level things that we're initially trying to write into the contracts.
So the other thing I would add is that we're using the BAA broad agency announcement. It's not unusual in the government. Actually, DARPA and NRO have done those in the past. DARPA does a lot of them. I understand. Matter of fact, my lead acquisition person at headquarters, that was what they did at DARPA, and that's why we picked him up to start these BAAs that we have. It's called the Next Step contract vehicle, and this is why you hear Appendix H and Appendix E and Appendix A. The stuff that at the luncheon that Doug Comstock was talking about are 2 appendices that we have as well. So it's a little bit innovative. It's innovative for NASA. It allows us a little more flexibility and freedom to do things a little bit differently, which is why you see what's happening here with our ability to move quickly, still have a contract, still put requirements on a vendor, and yet be a little bit more open with how we do the interaction and get the contract through the system quickly.
Right, and a little less prescriptive on. In the past, NASA would say, give me a very detailed, down to the formatting and everything of a data package, and we're trying to minimize that because that does take extra time on the contractor side. But we still need access to the analysis, to the to the drawings to understand, build to print, and make sure that from a technical and engineering standpoint that we're good to go.
And we have time for one more right here in the
Nick Morris from UAH. I guess I just wanted to ask how your plans change if Elon Musk beats you to Mars.
I missed that last part. How our plans change what?
If Elon beats us to Mars.
Elon's, I expect SpaceX will probably submit a proposal. We'll see. I don't see this as a competition by any means. We're not competing with SpaceX or Blue Origin or Boeing or Lockheed. We have a contract and we're looking for folks to engage with us and help us accomplish our goals. It's not a us them. It's not a new old. It's let's go to the moon and let's do it together. And I think that there's a lot of capability that SpaceX can bring to the table to make this happen.
Yeah, they were one of the companies, providing us feedback and as well as many other companies, and so we're listening to all of them, whether the ones that that Marshall listed, and I think it is important to know that NASA and all of private industry create the aerospace community, and it's a very symbiotic type relationship, and that's part of what I think you heard from the previous panel as well. Like I said, I think HLS is a direct result of let's try to find the best of what private industry has and the best of what the government has, and let's see if we can use that to enable speed, to try to get there together collectively as the United States of America.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, panel. That was great. Thank you. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick break. Once again, thank you to our sponsors for the break, Aerospace Corporation, KBR, and Teledyne Brown Engineering. Please do come back in right at 4:20. We got a great session with AIAA Young Professionals Winners presentations, and then a good talk on propulsion updates. So please come on back. Thanks.
I'm going to go ahead and and start this up. Scooch over just a little bit. See
Okay.
where you are there? There you go.
All right, yes.
There we are. Good. Okay. And make sure I'm, hello, testing. Yeah. Okay. So we're just, there's the camera. Okay. So we are back. I've got, by the way, I want to say that was a pretty cool Moon to Mars session we just watched. I was a lot of great comments on that. So thanks, guys. So today I have with me Kent Rominger, is that pronouncing that right?
That is right.
From Northrop Grumman, and he was involved in orbital ATK before you got acquired by Northrop Grumman. And you're a rocket launch solid booster guy, right?
Correct.
So you guys are involved in the solid boosters that are all part of the SLS. And he's also involved in the Artemis program. And he was just before we went live. He was telling me a lot of stories about the escape test that they were doing, and a lot about safety. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So welcome, Kent. I appreciate your taking time to talk with us. Let's start with the work you're doing with the SLS and the boosters.
Yeah, so at Northrop Grumman, we're really proud to be a part of the Space Launch System. The
Right.
big solid rocket boosters, which give us about 7 million pounds of thrust to get that beast in the air. We also do the launch abort system for Artemis, so we can, if we require, pull the crew away from that stack with a system that will accelerate the crew inside the capsule at 8 to 10 Gs away from the stack. So it very quickly, safely gets you away from the stack. We also fly a rocket Antares with carry a capsule Cygnus that resupplies space station. So we send supplies up to the astronauts on space station. And then another piece of involvement that I'm kind of leading is it's called a Mega, but it's a new rocket design that will complement Artemis. And it also meets all the requirements for the Air Force National Security Space Launch System. So we're designing a brand new rocket from the ground up that can put a lot of mass into orbit as well.
That's amazing. So you guys were telling me that, or you were telling me before we got started, that one of the big issues that we have to worry about going forward is that when you're working on Artemis and the SLS and all these other future launch systems, that we need to be safer. We need to be a lot safer. In fact, you said that you want the Artemis system and the SLS to be an order of magnitude safer than what was available for the space shuttle. And can you comment on that just a little bit? Because I loved the way you put it before we got started.
Yeah, so the big picture is, and by the way, I flew the space shuttle 5 times.
Yes.
So when you climbed on the space shuttle, historically we had seen that the odds of, a bad day were about 1 in 100.
And you flew 5 times. So you're starting to think.
Right. So and if you lose the shuttle, you lose the crew because there was no escape system. So, it became very evident for the follow-on to the space shuttle if you had an escape system. So, in general, it's not uncommon to lose a rocket every 1 in 100 flights. And if there's a crew on it, you lose that crew 1 in 100 flights unless you have an escape system. If you have a launch abort system, such as we designed for the Space Launch System, and it's 90% reliable, so 9 out of 10 times it will work perfectly, which is actually a fairly easy metric to meet. Now your chances of dying when you climb on the Space Launch System in Orion are about 1 in 1,000. So they're literally an order of magnitude better than the space shuttle was.
Yeah, and just to put that in perspective, man, I mean, you were also a combat pilot. And you flew in the Desert Storm.
Desert Storm,
That's right.
yes.
So, and what were your chances of dying?
Yeah, so
when you got into an aircraft,
again, back to statistics.
But I know, yeah.
When you fly in combat in a U.S. fighter, and I was flying an F-14 off the USS Nimitz back in 1991, my chances of dying in that F-14 when I went up over Iraq were about 1 in 20,000.
I'm sorry, that just blows me away. I mean, 1 in 20,000 in a combat situation, it is more dangerous from a statistical perspective.
Right. And you climb on the space shuttle, and your odds were about 1 in 100.
1 in 100.
Right.
That's right. So I mean, but okay. Getting back to the statistics, though, there hasn't been how many combat flights have there been over the time we've been measuring this? Right, tens of hundreds of thousands of flights, but with the space shuttle, there were just a few hundred. So the statistics are a little bit skewed, aren't they? I mean,
they are, right.
Yeah.
So the databases are much different.
Yeah, and they are, and you're right about the fact that there wasn't an escape system on the space shuttle. So, are you involved at all with the one in Orion? Are you?
We are.
Okay.
We
so
are.
what are you doing on that?
So that system is a really neat system.
And they just had a test. I'm sorry, they just tested that, right?
It tested perfectly, and it uses a large solid rocket motor that we built out in Utah. And if there's a problem, it's got so much thrust, it immediately pulls the capsule away from the stack. So you can even be on the launch pad in Florida, and if there's a problem with the rocket, say it catches on fire, you initiate the abort, and this system will instantaneously pull you away safely. And then it'll drop you off out in the ocean. And there's several parts to it, but the big motor we make, and then there's another solid rocket motor that positions. It is the control for the system, so you can control it, and the capsule comes away from the system at the right time, and then parachutes back into the ocean.
That sounds like one of the most sophisticated systems we've come up with so far, right?
Yes, and it's a very reliable system.
So let's see if I'm picturing this right. We're sitting on the launch pad. We're getting ready to launch. The launch has gone off. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Things start to go, but it catches fire. In that length of time, the escape system can catch fire, can launch and activate,
yes,
and still be able to pull the astronauts away in time before the rest of the rocket blows up.
That's right. And another scenario is, one of the more difficult, which is what they tested, is you're leaving the atmosphere. When you're building your speed, you have a maximum dynamic pressure.
That's right.
Where the loads on your system are the highest. It's also a point where controlling the system is the most challenging. And that's where we did the last test. That's where NASA did the last test with the system that we're part of. And when you initiate it, say you're going through that max dynamic pressure, and all of a sudden the rocket begins to fail, or you see an engine that's going to come apart, or it actually comes apart. You quickly initiate that, and it will automatically initiate itself too, as long as that is selected. And it will safely pull the crew away from the stack. So in the stack, you're accelerating at most at 3 Gs acceleration. Our system is in between 8 and 10.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was just about to go there.
So it definitely way outruns that rocket that you're already on. So
8 Gs, wow. That's gonna put some hurt on the astronauts, though. But at least it's not as much as if they stuck around.
Yeah, but it'll be a good hurt. It'll go the right way.
All right, well, Ken Rominger, thank you so much for taking time out to talk to our humble little audience here. We've had a great time with this symposium, and best of luck. And I hope we'll keep posted on what you're doing, and take it. Best of luck in all the work you're doing.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing.
Hey, all right, thank you guys. All right, you can just head on out if you want to. It's very informal here. We're just chatting. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys. Wow, that was a really good one. That was a good conversation. So that was Ken. I can't believe it. Do I really have sound problems? Really? Do I really have sound problems? Don't tell me that. You just said I didn't have sound problems. I bet I have to do this. Now, do I have sound problems? There's interference in the audio. Yeah. Yes, Chandrayaan 2, you should watch that. Okay. Well, so as you saw, I asked about JWST before we started, and he said no, because he doesn't know anything about JWST. So he's not on the project, doesn't work on it. He works on the other part with the, as you saw, the solid boosters. So, great. I should have unplugged the camera before I started. All right. Well, damn it. This just... Yeah, you know why it was good? Because I unplugged the camera. I'm on the battery power now. Before, it was fine. So, we'll see. I don't know what to say. Anyway, you could understand it. Oh, good. All right. Yeah, the reason it's good as soon as he left is I unplugged the power cord to the camera. Anyway, I thought that was a good interview. He was a nice guy, and they're doing some good work. So, I mean... Yeah, it's touchy. You didn't see it, but there were like 2 people right over here behind the camera watching him interview. So there was had to be careful on that. Anyway, that was cool. All right. Well, So we're on break right now. Things are coming back. What's coming next? What is coming next is 4:45 p.m. Central Time, propulsion system developments. That's going to be pretty good. There's, in fact, Kent is giving a talk on that, so he'll be one of the people on the panel to talk about that. NTP, I hope they talk about NTP and nuclear thermonuclear propulsion, whatever it is. That's coming up. So that'll be it, and then that'll be the last session, and it will end at about, I think, 5:30. Be about 45 minutes, and then that'll be the end of the day. So there we go. Thank you, Galaxia. I appreciate that. I'm glad it was okay. Sorry about the sound. Damn it. Do you guys have any idea what has to come together? All of it has to work, and I think maybe I have, I don't know, $1,500 in equipment. I mean, I have a laptop that does all of the streaming. I have a $700 camera that's years old now. I have a Rode shotgun mic, and that's my whole. And I have my little live view unit that I use for streaming in remote locations, and that is it. And all of it has to work. And Wirecast, the software that I use for this, is incredibly finicky and touchy and always breaking down. Well, for example, I'll tell you, last night I set up this whole show, all of it, the graphics and everything, and I got it working in my hotel room, and then I come here and start to plug it all in, and none of it worked. I had to restart all of it because Wirecast, you have to plug in the camera capture and the exact USB port you did before. You have to do the sound and the exact USB port that you did before. Otherwise, it won't find it. Sometimes also screen capture doesn't work. Imagine my surprise when I got here this morning and tried to capture the live stream only to find that Wirecast wouldn't capture it. So, yeah. Anyway, that's my issues. Those are for me to worry about. So anyway, we got a few minutes. What time is it? It's 4:16. We got about 15 minutes or so where we can chat. Thanks, Raj. I appreciate it. Let's see if anybody's over on Twitch while I'm here. I'm just sitting here. Oh, there's a couple. Uncle Bill's there. Hey, Uncle Bill. I think you're there. You might have gone away. You tend to watch a lot of different things. You're all over the place. You're a busy guy. So let's talk a little bit about this Moon to Mars panel. What did you guys think of that? I thought it was good. Didn't really learn a lot of new things though. I thought the panel this morning on the exploration systems update was better. Had more information on it, but it was this was pretty good. And how is Periscope? Oh, there it is. I don't know. I don't see any. It looks pretty quiet. Okay. Alrighty. Yeah. So looks pretty quiet on Periscope at the moment. Anybody there? You guys? No. Okay. The Halo module is news. Yeah. That's pretty cool. The habitable. What's it called? Habitable something. Lookout. Outpost was O. What was A? H was habitable. A was something. I forget what A and L were. But O was outpost. So anyway, that's going to be where people hang out. That was pretty cool. And I've told you guys before. I think that I personally think that the gateway is a good idea. I'm glad we're doing it, and I don't care what Robert Zubrin thinks. I think it's a good idea because it's we just don't have any experience out there. I mean, if you look at what we can actually do, I mean, Kent was just talking about the chances of dying in the space shuttle were 1 in 100, but if you're a combat aircraft pilot, it's 1 in 20,000. The numbers just aren't there. We don't have a lot of experience going out to deep space or anywhere out past the magnetosphere of the Earth. So it's naturally a very dangerous thing that we have to get right. And I would much prefer doing that closer to home than trying to do a first shot all the way over to Mars. And say what you will about Elon Musk. I know you guys love him. You want to have his baby, but you know, I just don't think he's going to care enough about safety. That's always been my concern with him. But I don't know. Maybe he will. Maybe he's not the one calling the shots. Maybe he's just, you know, taking the lead, you know, what's called the most visible look of the company, and he's not making a lot of the big calls. I don't know. Raj, I hope you're keeping yourself hydrated and taking breaks. Yeah, I just drank this. It's completely gone. This Powerade. Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's not that bad. But to be honest, just sitting here chatting with you in the live chat while these sessions are going on, it's no big deal. So I don't mind doing that. I'm going to put these in just in case the audio, when it starts to come back, the panel comes back, I know about it and I can switch over. But let's see. What was I in the middle of saying? Oh, that the experience of going out into space, deep space, and by deep space I just mean outside the magnetosphere of the Earth, which isn't that deep. I think we need more experience before we go to Mars. So I like the Gateway. I think it's the right thing to do, and I want to go to the moon. I want a presence on the moon, and I want to start building experience being on someplace else other than Earth. The only experience we've got in space is in the ISS, a lot of that, which is nice, but it's cocooned behind the magnetosphere, and 3-day shots to the moon where we wandered around and drove around and hopped around in the 1960s and 70s. And that's it. Going to Mars. I'm sorry, we're just not ready. And I think that this going to the moon will be a good way to start. So remember to stand up every now and once in a while. Yeah, I know. Oh God. I'm going to show this comment because it's funny. Maybe it's because I'm punchy. So let's see. Look at the Dragon 2 landing system. I don't know if that was going to be safe. Yeah. I mean, I will hand it to SpaceX though. They are doing a good job with their landing systems. I mean, anybody who's seen a Falcon 9 launch can see that. But all of this stuff still remains to be tested. Did they discuss artificial gravity? No, you know, they didn't. And the thing is, they're not talking about any of that with respect to going to Mars. The boots on the Mars program is way underdeveloped. So as far as NASA goes, anyway. So no, they didn't. No one's talked about that yet. And I think that we're probably going to need some kind of artificial gravity if we're going to stay up there for years at a time. And the Gateway, oh, there goes the bell. The Gateway is getting ready to, I think they're going to have something like that on the Gateway to test, but it'll be small scale. All right, anyway, well, okay, maybe not on the Gateway, but they are at least going to use it as a test bed for something that might have artificial gravity, right? So, like I said, the best thing about the Gateway is that it's a test bed for the technology we need to go to Mars and to even go to the moon. So they are at least going to have those kinds of things. So no, they didn't really. Gregorius, we need more experience with the Van Allen belt radiation conditions in outer space. That's my point. Yes, I think that this has got to be worked on more, and we're not doing enough. We don't have any experience in it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. They are reconvening, so I'm going to start the next session, and when that comes back, that will be. I will say goodbye to you guys for the day, and then that will be that. I know it's getting late in Europe, so thank you guys, Galaxia, and I think Peter's long gone now. I think Adam is long gone, but if you're out in the UK and Europe and Germany and those places, it's getting late. So thanks for hanging in there. And but this is being recorded, so I mean you can always watch the VOD later if you want to. So, all right, talk to you later, and let's go ahead and start the last session, which is on propulsion system developments. So that's coming up. Okay, well, they still haven't started yet, so I thought they were going to get started right away, and I'm just sitting here. So, yeah. Hey, so Adam and Galaxia, you're still there. That's awesome. I thought you guys, yeah, 22, 24 UK. Oh, Raj, you're in the UK too, of course. So, yeah, you guys are really hardcore. I was talking about you guys to these people here, saying that there's a group of you that are intensely interested and can't get enough of all these kind of information that we put out, and that it's very valuable to you because you use it for your own education, for your own decision makings about policy, and when you do vote, all of these things are in your head. And I said, I think that for people like yourselves, there are very few avenues out there. Yes, there are a lot of things that are geared toward the general public, but I've always kind of liked to really make things that were not geared for the general public, but were geared toward what I call the informed taxpayer, and that's you guys. You guys take the time to learn things. You know a lot more about a lot of things in this than I do, and you don't mind, going through a lot of detail and jargon and learning as much as there is. And because of that, I think it feels a really good, important need. So, and not a lot of people are doing it. Yeah, I don't get huge viewers. I don't have the same viewership that a lot of other channels and YouTube science communicators have. But I also don't care. I'm not doing this for a wide audience. If I were, I'd have to be more like them. I'd have to be more engaging, more gregarious, more personal. I don't like sharing a lot of personal stuff, so I don't do a lot of that. So I don't know. I just feel like we dig in deep. I mean, we talk. We know what we're talking about. We have a knowledge level that most won't have, that most people would find, I think, boring, or they just don't care. We've seen plenty of comments. All of us, have seen the comments of, I don't understand this. What are you talking about? This is boring. But you gotta get into this to be really informed. You gotta dig deep. And for me to sit here and tell you, well, JWST is all put together and ready to go onto the barge, is one thing. And I guess that's a useful piece of knowledge. And Spaceman News, in that regard, does fill sort of a niche, I guess. I mean, other people like Fraser do it better, but my little show, gets seen by quite a few people. I was pretty pleased with the Chandrayaan 2 video. It got over 100,000 views. That was pretty amazing. But I basically do what I care about, what I find interesting, what news I find important, and what news I think you would enjoy that maybe isn't being covered enough. And one thing I do notice, though, sometimes, I'm going to take credit for this, is that I'll do a Spaceman News on something, and then I will see a lot of other posts about that same topic after I've done one. So that's kind of cool. Sometimes I post later after everybody else has posted on it, but every once in a while I do see that. I do see that Spaceman News was first. It was kind of neat. So kudos to you guys for wanting to do this. Gosh, you guys have been here for hours. You've been here as long as I have. It's like you're in the conference, and we're kind of all here together. And what have we learned? We've learned from the people who are working on it what space policy is being implemented. We've learned from the people working in the program what's going on with Gateway and what's going on with Artemis and what's going on with Moon to Mars and all of this stuff. We're learning ourselves right now from the people who work here, and in some cases we get to sit down and talk with them. So I don't know. I just want to give you guys a shout out because I'm impressed. People say that you got to always make content that appeals to the public. I'm not so sure. Appealing to the masses requires a completely different delivery than I really even want to do. I don't really care about appealing to tens of thousands of people at one time. I care about appealing and filling a need to guys like you and me who want to really dig in. And so, if it gets 100 views, if it gets 1,000 views, whatever. That's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because we love it. We want to learn more. So, yeah, and you guys can join in on the conversation. I want you guys to be here. You guys bring as much, if not more, to the conversation, to the hangout than I do. And in many cases, it'd be fun if there were an easy way for me to let you in and out of a hangout. Like a call-in show or something like that, where we could just get together and chat. Because who knows? I mean, it might take off. Okay, they're getting ready to go now. Here we go.
Presentation, and this one's going to be even more different. It's going to have our 3 winners from the Next Gen AIAA conference that occurred earlier this week. And to start off this VB Extra, I'm going to introduce my friend Mario Cipendi, my Moog colleague, and I would say my favorite Moog colleague in Huntsville, but you're just one of my favorite colleagues at all. So come on up, Mary.
What he forgot to say is I'm one of the few Moog people in Huntsville. So first, obviously I have quite an honor to be able to introduce to you the winners of the technical presentations that were judged by panels of their peers. But I do want to certainly give a big shout out to all of you who stayed. So you got a break, a 20-minute break, and you didn't leave. There's another panel after this, which is going to make your day longer. And I think it's going to be a very interesting panel, but you didn't leave for that either. So I think you're going to enjoy the last hour or so session that we have planned for you. For those of you who may not know, as Chris alluded to, there was a AIAA Young Professionals Next Generation event that occurred on Monday and Tuesday of this week. This kind of is a greater Southeast focus. It brings together innovators, researchers, engineers, technical presentations are made, there are workshops, there's actually a little bit of career speed dating that was offered, and as it's an annual event, they try to expand on this every year, and for next year, they're actually going to try to include a classified section. So Logicor was the company that hosted that event, which is also in Cummings Research Park. So at the conclusion of the event, there were about 35 technical presentations that were judged. The top 3 were selected, and those gentlemen are with us today. I'd like to start with Dr. David Nover. He is a senior technical fellow with People Tech. Quite a distinguished academic career, not to mention what he's done professionally since. He earned his PhD from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Also went to Princeton University for his Bachelor's of Science in Theoretical Physics. He's authored more than 100 technical publications, which include research articles and book chapters. His role today with People Tech focuses primarily on machine learning, algorithms, and data mining. So please help me welcome Dr. David Nover.
All right, so I want to take 5 minutes to convince you that these are the 3 maps that will change the world. We have Magellan in the lower corner to convince us that we are a marble we live on. We have the actual blue marble, which, take note, is blue and white, and we're going to come back to that. And then we have a different kind of map, which is at the cross-section of small satellites and machine learning. And I call this, along with other people, the functional map of the world. In other words, rather than see the blue marble, we're going to start counting things, ships on the ocean, planes at airports, etc. So this is Washington, D.C. This is about 7-centimeter resolution. It's very high fidelity for urban planning. And then we're going to superimpose the functional map of the world. So we counted and boxed 16,000 between Capitol and White House. And I want to explore the limits of that. And the title of the talk is, where does this data come from? And so what is machine learning generally in the vision space? There are kind of 3 breakout areas: audio, vision, and text. I'm really just going to focus on vision here. And this is what's called a convolutional neural net. You can look at it as a big stack filter system. And in the lower corner, you actually see how a plane can be decomposed at the pixel level into many, many smaller features. So we actually can uncover, we evolve from pixels. This is not edge detection. We're just evolving an airframe or a fuselage. The problem is, typically these have 100 million parameters. It's tremendous overfit, which means tremendous internet scale data. So can we use, the primary question is, can we use synthetic worlds to map to my dream of the real functional map? And the answer is yes. So here's a first case. One thing I mentioned about the white and blue marble is 50% of the chances of satellite photos are going to be cloud cover, right? Nothing really interesting, and you have to waste a lot of download space. So we want to synthesize weather at certainly not full overcast, but partial overcast, and see if we can recognize objects inside of it. So this is an example where we essentially removed clouds. We train a neural network to recognize planes, and then we superimpose random mask of clouds. And it turns out we actually can see through clouds at a certain level. At some point, you need something like synthetic radar, aperture radar, but this is a kind of an interesting case of using synthetic world to get at the real world. Here's a second case. How do I fix a broken camera? So you can take, in the lower corner, we want to recognize this intersection, and we have about 30 centimeter resolution, a pixel. And then we're going to squash it and blow it back up. So we're basically going to lose information. And so the small sat is this sort of black and white thing at the top. And it turns out you can't recognize cars, but you can still see macro objects like the intersection. So we can use synthetic data to fix bad cameras. Finally, we want to ask, can I merge it with the video world? Can I drop models and train? And one of the complaints is my objects I want to recognize are unicorns. Maybe it's some odd object that we only have 20 aircraft carriers. How am I going to generate millions of versions of that? And one answer to that is to try video. The one thing that you should be, so I essentially dropped in 3D models and generate hundreds of images a second. And then we train on those. And the problem is I get 100% recognition. That tells me probably something's going on. I've memorized the actual object. And there's a reason for that. And one of the vulnerabilities of this overfit, this massive number of parameters, is I can train a neural net to recognize an elephant. I can train it to recognize a cat. I can wrap the cat in the elephant. It thinks it's an elephant. So at the limit of what it sees, it doesn't see like we see. It actually is very sensitive to texture. And so now we want to exploit that. So when I talk about a shiny metal 3D CAD drawing, I've lost the texture of the actual airplane I'm looking for. So I want to explore that and basically ask the question, we have historically viewed color as camouflage. To a machine, texture is camouflage. So in essence, I can drop a crack or a net or a forest on top of this and begin to make guesses. It's no longer a plane, it's now a jigsaw puzzle, and so forth. And that shows an actually interesting application. Just like with a stealth bomber learns how to deflect radar, I can essentially learn how to deflect shape detection by texture. So the conclusions are, where is the synthetic world going to help us? Generally, this is a well-developed field. It's called data augmentation. I rotate my images, I shear them, I change the brightness. I get many, many more examples. But really what I can't do is simulate interesting things that I will encounter in the real world from synthetic. One interesting case I think is promising is weather, just because we live on a white and blue marble. The other interesting case is I can simulate camera fixers. Resolution is under my control. Where it's probably not is the thing of simulating a unicorn, a rare object that we do not have millions of examples of. But finally, there is an opportunity there to exploit texture and not color as the new camouflage. Thank you.
Did you want to hold questions till the end or? Okay, all right. So our next winner, Dr. Matthew Hitt, comes to us from the U.S. Army. He's in the Space and Missile Defense Command. He got his PhD in mechanical engineering right here at UAH. He's a general engineer and has conducted his research primarily on additively manufactured fuel grains for axial injection and burning hybrid rocket motors and analysis of performance of satellite constellations. Did I get that right? You did. Okay. Now you can tell us what all that means.
So one of the things I would say looking back is I probably should have picked a research topic with a shorter name. But the question you may be asking is, what is an axial injection and burning hybrid rocket motor? And so here's a schematic of what it is. So for those of you that are not as familiar with hybrid rocket motors, they're a form of chemical rocket propulsion. One of the propellants is in a solid phase, the other is in a liquid or gaseous phase. hence hybrid of liquid and solid propulsion, typically have a combustion chamber in the middle where all the action occurs. But in this particular configuration, the oxidizer is injected at the head end, flows through the grain without combustion to the end surface where the combustion occurs. This has two advantages. One, it increases the packing efficiency of the grain. So instead of having a lot of void space in your combustion chamber, you now have fuel. And two, it also burns a lot faster, which is one of the limiting factors for hybrid rocket motors. So there's some experiments on this, but then the question is, well, what could you actually do with this in a satellite application? So as I mentioned, regression rate's higher, follows a pressure base, took that data, fed it into a model using ABS plastic as the field, so something that you could get off a 3D printer. It's basically Lego, safe, easy to handle, be good for small satellite operations and gaseous oxygen as the oxidizer, partly because from before we had that data for the regression rate, so we could actually model that somewhat accurately. Then said, all right, coming up with a baseline configuration for the fuel grain, sizing the oxidizer propellant mass for that, then was able to calculate the velocity change that you could provide to either a 3U, a 6U, or a 9U CubeSat. So something fairly small, not looking at launching anything into space with this type motor configuration. So took that data, obviously you don't assume that it's going to be perfectly efficient, so we did different chamber pressures, different characteristic velocity efficiencies, did of course the ideal case, but also 90%, something realistic, and based on all the calculations came up with a specific impulse that you would expect somewhere around the area of 280 seconds, so realistic for chemical bipropellant motors. And then delta V's of maybe around 450 meters per second for a 3U satellite, 220 meters per second for a 6U, and then around 145 for a 9U. So a little bit of delta V, could do some missions, but then obviously led to the question of, well, is this good enough? You can do numbers and say, this is great, you can provide X amount of delta V, but is that really useful? So just for the assessment of how useful this is, first went through, analyzed some different orbital maneuvers that might occur, such as altitude raising, altitude maintenance, deorbiting, phasing. One of the popular things with small satellites is constellations. So if you deploy them all in one position, what would it take to actually spread them out to get the coverage you desire? So taking those calculations for different maneuvers, came up with a notional type maneuver set for 6U satellites. For instance, let's say you're deployed into a 300-kilometer parking orbit and you want to phase your orbit at 3 degrees per day, so that's about 43 meters per second. Then you want to raise your altitude to 400 kilometers for 57 meters per second, and then maintain your altitude for 2 years. That comes up to around 200 meters per second total of delta V required, compared to the 220 meters per second that the model is predicting that the motor could provide. So it wouldn't be any fancy, exquisite mission. You're not going to be going circling around all the asteroids or anything, but a simple mission for a simple satellite in low Earth orbit. So overall, the models indicate that this type motor configuration would have potential use in a hybrid, as a hybrid rocket motor propulsion system in a small satellite. And that was it.
Okay, and our final winner is Robert Hederich. Robert is an aerospace engineer in the Advanced Concepts Office out at Marshall. So congratulations to you. He has received his mechanical engineering degree from Lehigh University, and an aerospace master's program was completed at Georgia Institute of Technology, right? Okay. And your focus is primarily on optimization, regression modeling, automation, and advanced design techniques applied to space systems. Okay, so please help me welcome.
So, So today I'm going to be talking to you briefly about a design study that I carried out. And so for this design study, we had to use some non-traditional sort of design techniques to carry out the optimization of the first stage solid rocket motor for the Mars Ascent vehicle. And so we can start this off by generally looking at a high level what the sample return mission looks like for this Mars mission of interest. So first we start out with the Mars 2020 rover being brought to the Martian surface where it's collecting samples. Several years after that, we're sending a lander, an ascent stage, and an orbiter to Mars. And the Mars 2020 rover will transfer its samples to a capsule located on the ascent stage. That ascent stage will then launch from the Martian surface, and it'll transfer that sample capsule to the orbiter. And that orbiter will bring the capsule back to the Earth's surface where we can do studies on the Martian material. And the team at Marshall Space Flight Center in particular is working on designing the Mars Ascent vehicle portion of this mission. And so at the time that I was brought into the study, there was a need to refresh or update the design of the first stage solid rocket motor for the Mars Ascent vehicle. And so they brought me in to carry out an optimization design study for this motor. So in this study, we were looking to maximize the total delta V of the first stage of the Mars Ascent vehicle. And we wanted to maximize the total ideal delta V because this gives us a good balance of maximizing the ISP while also minimizing the total inert mass of the motor, and we can represent that in a single objective function. And traditionally, when we're carrying out this type of design study, we would essentially just take our design tool of interest. And so for this study, we're using the Solid Performance Program, or SPP, to simulate our solid rocket motors. We would wrap that in an optimizer and just run our optimization to convergence. However, due to the size of the design space that we were dealing with for this design problem, in order for any of our optimizations to converge, the optimizer needs to evaluate several thousand motors. So we need to evaluate SPP several thousand times for a single optimization. And with the amount of time that it takes SPP to run a single simulation or to evaluate a single parametric motor, the amount of time it takes to run a single optimization is very long, and to run the multiple optimizations we want to do, it's basically an infeasible amount of time to the point where we can't reasonably carry out our design study while using SPP in our optimization loop. So we need to utilize a different sort of methodology that helps us to speed up our parametric motor analysis without losing too much of our model fidelity that we want to have for evaluating the motors. To do this, we utilize surrogate modeling techniques. And so for those of you who are not familiar, a surrogate model is essentially just a regression model of your simulation environment. And so in order to create these surrogate models, we first need to automate our simulation environment. So we need to automate SPP and allow it to run in a batch mode so that we can run many, many motors through it in an automated fashion. After we've done that, we need to create a design of experiments which spans across our entire motor design space of interest. And we run that entire design of experiments through our batch mode environment, collecting all of the results. Once we've done that, we can actually look at any sort of outputs of interest from our motor sizing. So for this, for example, we might want to look at the maximum pressure of the motor, burn time of the motor, things like that that we either want to constrain or that are going to affect our objective function. And we create these regression models that can predict those outputs of interest anywhere in our design space. And so for this study, we had to use neural networks due to the nonlinearity of the design space. And so obviously we need to carry out some sort of validation verification to ensure that we're not doing any sort of overfitting, and so that our models can predict well inside our design space. And then finally, we can kind of go back to where we started and try to re-implement our original optimization as we planned to, but this time, rather than using SPP in the optimization loop to evaluate our motors, we can now use these surrogate models in place of SPP to evaluate our motors. And by using these surrogate models in place, we can significantly speed up our optimization. In this case, I was able to speed up the optimization about 1,000 times while still not losing much of the general fidelity that we use to evaluate our motors. So after we got that optimization running, we ran through a variety of different optimizations. We optimized several different motors, So this is just an example of one of those motors. That image on the top is the original baseline design for the Mars Ascent Vehicle first stage solid rocket motor. And the image below that is the same exact motor after we've run it through our optimizer with the surrogate models. And so you can see that our optimizer is primarily trying to pack the propellant in the motor as efficiently as it possibly could in order to shorten the motor, because when we shorten the motor is going to weigh less because we have less casing, and it also gives us more length for our nozzle to increase our ISP and generally improve the performance of the motor. And so for this motor in particular, we're able to have some pretty significant improvements to the length of the motor and general mass of the motor to improve the overall performance. So to kind of quickly wrap everything up, we started out this study with the goal of running an optimization study to improve the design of the Mars Ascent Vehicle solid rocket motor on the first stage. Using traditional methods, it seemed like this optimization would be infeasible to carry out due to long run times. However, using these types of surrogate modeling techniques, we were able to significantly speed up our optimization while still not giving up a significant amount of fidelity in our motor evaluations. And by the end of the study, we were able to generate and deliver a new motor design for the MAV first stage to act as the new baseline with improved performance characteristics.
Thank you. You don't want to run too much over time, so maybe what we should do is, if you have any questions, I think our gentleman will probably hang with us, hopefully through the propulsion panel, and you can get them at the end of the sessions today. One more round of applause for 3 incredibly talented people.
So the next panel can make their way down and we'll get you set up. Right behind you.
Okay, while they're setting up, I just want to say real quick that Gregorius, you're not going to get a very good planisphere where you live in Indonesia, but you know they're still cool to have. Planispheres are really cool, but they're kind of old school. So you're probably going to have to just buy 2, one at like latitude 20 degrees north and 20 degrees south, and then find what you're looking at in the sky and tape them together. All right, they're back.
Director, Space Business Development at Aerojet Rocketdyne, and Kent Rominger, Vice President of Omega Capture of Northrop Grumman. And I'm going to let each one of them give a little intro of what they're doing in propulsion at their companies with a few slides, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. Let's see. All right. So just real quickly, Blue Origin is about a little over 2,000 people now, growing fast. When I joined 10 years ago, we were about 75 people. So we've been ramping up quite a bit, doubling in size every few years in the last decade. But I really want to point out our Huntsville, Alabama location, which over at Cummings Research Park, you'll see a very large building going up. And in fact, I hadn't seen it since it was just a foundation, and it's much, much larger than I had expected just by driving past it. So we have selected Huntsville to build a factory for manufacturing and producing our engines. We'll build the BE4 and BE3U engines, which will be used on our new Glenn launch vehicle. BE4 will also be used on ULA's Vulcan launch system. And just down the road in Decatur. But we'll also be, we have taken over Marshall Test Flight or Test Stand 4670 to do testing of engines, the acceptance testing of the BE4 and the BE3U engines there as well, just across the road at Marshall. So the engines that we produce right now real fast, BE3 is flying our new Shepherd vehicle. BE3U is a hydrogen upper stage variant of the BE3 that will go on New Glenn. BE4 is a LOX methane first stage engine that is the 550,000 pounds of thrust, and the BE7 is our new lunar lander engine at about 10,000 pounds of thrust. Let me just real quickly show you each of these engines. The BE3 has flown to space on 11 missions of New Shepard. 2 engines have done 5 of those flights each, so each one did 5 flights to space and back, and that's a relight of each engine as it lands down. Our BE4 engine, sorry the font got messed up here, but the BE4 engine is 550,000 pounds of thrust. We've tested it at full power already, 102% in fact, and thousands of seconds of test time on that engine so far. And these are all being tested down in our Texas site before they will start, I think next year, if not the year before, being tested at Marshall 4670. Our BE3U upper stage engine, we did some back-to-back turbine testing that you see on the left there. And then we've added to the back-to-back turbine a thrust chamber demonstrator that you see there in the middle as well being tested, and thousands of seconds of test time on that as well. And then our BE7 lunar lander engine, in May we unveiled this large mock-up or full-size mock-up of our Blue Moon lunar lander, and over the summer we did 2 different test campaigns on the BE7 engine at Marshall. This is one of the latest tests, and that's an IR video of the test. It's 10,000 pounds of thrust over at being tested at Marshall. So with that, I look forward to your questions.
Okay, next Dave's going to talk about Moog.
All right, thank you, Mary Beth. I'm Dave Chavez with Moog, and when I come to forums like this, I'll introduce myself and somebody will say, "Oh, I know Moog." And I say, and the next thing out of their mouth is, "Oh, I know you for one of 2 reasons. One is I know you for actuators." And so yes, we do actuators. We've been doing actuation essentially since the founding of the company back in the 50s. Traditional hydraulic actuators. At the turn of the century, we got into electromechanical actuation, and if you happen to watch the Apollo 50 landing, I'm talking about the turn of the 21st century, not the 20th century. And most recently, electrohydrostatic actuation. So it was on Ken's static fire test. We had an electrohydrostatic actuation TVC system on that. The other answer I would get when I ask, or when I introduce myself and say I'm from Moog is, "Oh, I know Moog, you make valves." And so yes, along with motion control, we do fluid control as well. So we make valves for different size engines, for in-space engines. We make valves for liquid launcher engines. We make cold gas thrusters, a lot of different components that are used on the engines themselves. I think maybe you don't know Moog for some of the other things that we do. So along the way here, we've acquired some additional technologies, and just want to talk about those for 1 minute. We have electromechanical actuation that is for on-orbit use that can go for anything from a solar array drive to a gimbal assembly on an electric propulsion engine. We make motors, slip rings, fiber optic joints down for kind of the one tier down. We also make a lot of vibration control equipment. So soft ride is to isolate payloads, full payloads. We also isolate components on orbit, as well as make the ESPA ring, which most people are familiar with. In 2012, we purchased Ampact ISP up in Niagara Falls. It's about 30 miles away from our headquarters, and so we also do. So now we are in the small thruster, the on-orbit thruster business, as well as making tanks and small propulsion subsystems. And then lastly, we purchased Broadreach Engineering, which makes on-orbit avionics. Some of the advancements that we've been working on most recently, so we have an additive manufacturing center at our facility in East Aurora. We have about 15 additive machines, as well as a full-up materials lab to go with that. So we've been doing a fair amount of research on in the additive manufacturing area. We've looked at, in the lower left there, you see an additively manufactured injector for one of our engines. We've actually also, the next picture kind of coming around at the 10 o'clock point there is an additively manufactured CubeSat size, a 1U complete propulsion system. It has a rolling metal diaphragm tank that was additively manufactured, built within it. So that's kind of us just, it's not quite ready for prime time, but we're working on it. Another area is down in the lower left, you see some fluid couplings. So we do a lot of the valve work. We're looking to do couplings for on-orbit servicing in the future. So we think we can support that piece of the industry going forward. We have a fair amount of capability in high power electronics. We've kind of acquired that or built that capability over time. Driving our electromechanical actuation systems. And so we've leveraged that into a very high efficiency DC-DC converter that can be used on applications like a PPE or wherever we need to convert high power. Lastly, we've kind of taken that and put it all into one spot, take an OMV, put some propulsion in it, put some avionics in it, and you end up with an OMV, and I'd like to just close with a video of that. There we go.
Great, thanks, Dave. Next, Tom's going to talk a little bit about what's going on at Aerojet Rocketdyne.
Thank you, Mary Beth. So I have a recurring discussion with my dad. He's a business professor, has no space background, only knows what he reads about in the newspaper. And the discussion always comes down to his point, why is it so hard and why is it so expensive to do space flight? And my answer always boils down to, well, physics, Dad, and don't you know about the rocket equation? and then we changed the subject. But that conversation got me thinking, why is there such a disparity between my dad's perception of where we should be in space flight and my perception, maybe a little bit more insider information on why we are where we are. And it occurred to me that the public has a general perception of technology advancement shaped by all the things that have happened in the information side of the world, the iPhones, all the things we do online. And that's fundamentally been driven by the microprocessor and the incredible increase in power with that. So I thought it would be interesting to see how a propulsion organization is doing against the benchmark for technology advancement. So I pulled this plot up of microprocessor power increase, and we all know Moore's law, right? Every 18 months, processor power doubles, and that is a logarithmic scale there on the y-axis. And I thought, let's plot a good performance metric for liquid propulsion. In this case, I chose combustion efficiency of a LOX hydrogen engine, and I plotted it from 1975-ish to where we've gotten to today, and I was extremely disappointed. But then I said, well, that benchmark, that's the RS-25, the shuttle main engine, and in 1975, when it began testing, it was operating at a 99.9% C-star efficiency. So I thought, okay, maybe that isn't that bad. And it turns out if you plot most of the important characteristics of liquid chemical propulsion, it's a similar line. So what's my point? I'm not sure I have one. First, I think NASA made a very smart decision in selecting the RS-25 and the RL-10 as the primary liquid propulsion solutions for the SLS, because quite frankly, you're not going to get much better from a performance perspective. We have 16 engines on RS-25 ready to go to support the first 4 flights of SLS. The new engines are in production right now. And similarly on the RL-10, the first ICPS engine is down at KSC ready to go. We've finished qualification on the first 4 engines that will go into the EUS upper stage. And from the performance perspective, our focus has shifted to focusing not on the performance, because there's, quite frankly, we're at a marginal gains perspective. We're focused on how do we reduce the cost, how do we improve the reliability, and how do we cut down on the lead time to produce these engines. And that's where the focus, at least in propulsion on the booster side, has focused on the additive manufacturing and other manufacturing technologies that can accomplish those objectives. That's where RS-25 is starting to leverage additive manufacturing in its design. RL-10 recently is moving to what we call the CX configuration, where we've got a fully AM'd combustion chamber and injector. So that's where our focus is on propulsion. Second, since this is a panel on new propulsion, if chemical is kind of tapped out, and don't get me wrong, chemical propulsion remains incredibly challenging to do, especially booster propulsion. We gotta tap new sources of energy for our propulsion, and the obvious ones are solar and nuclear. And so from Aerojet Rocketdyne's perspective, that's where we are focusing. And the one advantage we have there is a lot of the focus now is how do we operate in space. Having a greater than 1 thrust to weight ratio remains critical for launch, but once we're in space, we have a little more freedom. So that's where solar electric propulsion is becoming extremely important to our business, and I think to NASA's plans. It is not something that is new to us. We've been flying very high power systems on national security and comms. We're working with NASA very closely. And then nuclear. Nuclear has been around for a long time. There are no new ideas in aerospace, but what has changed? The ISP is roughly double the best chemical systems, but the big game changer is the use of low enriched uranium for the reactors, and that gets us through a lot of problems that you had using highly enriched uranium and all of the problems associated with that. As a propulsion guy, I think it's also really cool because it actually looks a whole lot like a conventional engine. On the right there is an upper stage RL-10. On the right is a 25,000 pound thrust NTP engine that we've been working with Marshall and partners like Dynetics and BWXT. And if you get past the challenge of the reactor and integrating it into the engine cycle, The rest of it, it's all hydrogen. It looks like a lot about what we already know how to do on upper stages. So pretty cool. So we're really looking towards the in spaces where we advance the technology. Booster propulsion, upper stage propulsion will remain the core of our company, but it's marginal gains. If we want to do game-changing stuff in propulsion, we got to focus on the in-space stuff, and a lot of that is we're working directly with NASA on. The next seed program, the AEPS thruster program, the 100 kilowatt next are all enabling, and particularly if we're talking crewed Mars missions, eventually NTP I think is going to be extremely important. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. And last, Kent, will you talk about what's going on at Northrop Grumman?
I would love to, especially if Tom hands me the clicker.
I'll hit the button for you.
Thank you. Hey, so thank you all for coming today. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is what's been going on at Northrop in the solid rocket motor propulsion world. And probably the easiest way to describe it is through a launch vehicle, a launch system that we're developing, Omega. So we have a model outside in the lobby of Omega. It's not as well known as I wished it were. I'm the capture manager, so I'm here to give us more exposure. And the Omega system consists of 2 rockets, and they consist of solid boost. And the intermediate rocket, which will fly in 2021, is the smaller one you see at the lower left side of the screen. And our design is around a common boost segment. So in the propulsion world, we know the space shuttle motors were segmented. Space Launch System motors are segmented. So segmented motors are nothing new. What is new with these motors are the propellant that we're using and their composite cases. And so the composite cases give you a great strength to weight ratio. And on the larger motors, it allows us to run pressures that can give us better efficiencies out of these motors as well. The first stage is 2 segments, and out of those 2 segments, you roughly get a couple of million pounds of thrust. Our second stage is a single segment, and it's just under 1 million pounds of thrust. And that second stage motor is common between our intermediate and our heavy. And the reason we have 2 systems, or this system was designed to meet the Air Force's national security space launch missions. And they vary. They vary from fairly simple LEO missions to fairly complicated direct GEO missions with large, expensive payloads. And today what we see is we've got Atlas V, Delta IV Heavy that span that range, Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy that span that range. And so it really is to span that range. For best value, it makes sense to have a system that is not just a single rocket. In addition to the solid boost on the core, we have strap-on motors to augment it. So you can tailor the performance that you need for your payloads. And it's a GEM 63 XL. The GEM 63 XL is kind of a big brother from the GEM 63. The GEM 63 is being used by ULA for Atlas V. It's been test fired twice. The XL is a 5.5 foot longer version of that for our system. It's also being used by ULA. For propulsion on the upper stage, we've got the extremely reliable RL-10, very efficient RL-10. And again, when you're launching national security payloads, reliability of your system is very, very important. And so when we took that into account, we knew that we needed a system that would be very reliable, and the RL-10 is kind of the leading one on the globe. Also, we need to get it a plug for solid propulsion. In the last 15 years, knock on wood, in the U.S. in space launch, we've had 100% success out of our solid rocket motors. Here are some shots that I think Tom and Dave will appreciate. Upper left is the GEM 63, just an inert, but to show you that motor being processed. To the right of it, kind of transitioning to the upper end of the rocket, that's the dome, the dome that's going through qualification. We are manufacturing that at the Michoud assembly facility, not too far down the road. And then below it is some of Dave's handiwork, but the electrohydrostatic TVC system. It's beautiful hardware. For those of you that love hardware, getting to see these actuators, they're absolutely gorgeous. Kind of transition to the right, it just shows a wind tunnel. There's the RL-10. going through qual testing back in November of 18. We chose an igniter to light a solid rocket motor, use a smaller solid rocket motor. That's the test firing of it. In May of 19, we test fired our first stage of Omega, and we're happy to say several years ago we picked that quarter, and actually May is the time we would static test fire that motor. We held that schedule. And then to the lower right corner is a really cool thing, and that's Mobile Launch Platform 3 that we're going to use to launch out of the East Coast at the Kennedy Space Center. We're launching off of 39B, the same launch pad that SLS Artemis used. This mobile launch platform launched Neil Armstrong about 50 years ago on Apollo 11. I also, turns out, flew off of this mobile launch platform 3 times myself. Unfortunately, not going to the moon. But I put in a slide with large solid rocket motors. A lot of times I get the question, what about your ride quality? Isn't the ride really rough on large solid rocket motors? And the answer is no. We designed this system from the ground up to have very benign environments, because unlike a liquid, we can't throttle real time. So we have to design the system to meet all those ride requirements that come along. And in fact, so I expect you can't read that chart, but what it's showing you is we're within all the requirements. And if you pull handbooks from other rockets that are out there today, we actually have a smoother ride than those other systems. Lastly, this technology we're using on Omega, turns out our motors are the same diameter as those on Shuttle and SLS. And so it has great applications to the booster obsolescence for SLS. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mary.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your introduction about what exciting things are going on in your companies on propulsion. I'm just going to ask a few questions to get us started, and then we'll open it up to the audience. First, Brett, can you talk about, as our focus shifts from low Earth orbit to the moon, what do you think the gaps in propulsion technology are that need to be addressed?
So I think some of the other panelists also mentioned that, in space is very different from boost propulsion. And so in space, you don't need a thrust to weight of 1, but you really need to have high efficiency. And so, we're developing a LOX hydrogen engine, the BE-7 engine for a lunar lander for in-space application, as well as our BE-3U upper stage engine, which is much, much bigger at about 160,000 pounds of thrust. But the point was also made that nuclear propulsion is sort of, the ultimate of where we want to go, because it's important for higher efficiency and higher ISP in the long term. But in terms of NASA's Artemis program and eventual Mars missions, foundational for that is high efficiency LOX hydrogen propulsion. And so we've been working on that for over a decade now. So.
Okay, great. Dave, with all the renewed interest in space by NASA and the DoD we heard about today, how do you feel the country's industrial base and suppliers, are they strong enough to support all this future work? If not, what can we do to help?
So I can kind of answer that from a tier 1, 2 supplier kind of framework. I think the industrial base, I think we struggled a bit coming out of the late 2008 to whatever 12, 14 time frame. You had the retirement of the shuttle, you had DoD kind of winding down a bit, and I think the industrial base kind of went with that some. And I think to the point where many of the suppliers actually exited the business. So you kind of fast forward to a couple years ago, and suddenly space comes back, and it seemed to come back with a vengeance then. And so you look around and you go, oh boy, now what? And so I think it kind of caught the whole industrial base flat-footed. And so we're trying to recover from that. I think there's still a couple things that are driving against that maybe. One is, I think you look around, I know my company kind of is trying to figure out the answer, and maybe the government is too. Where is vertical integration going to take us in the future? And if it's going to, be the real wave of the future, then it's going to affect the industrial base for sure. I think that still has to play out some, and we'll see where that goes. I think another thing that we felt are the advent of the OTA. And so now the government is expecting companies to invest more heavily in their programs, and that's getting driven down to the next tier as well. So we've been feeling some of that. I think lastly, as we try and get back on good footing here, we feel the same thing everybody else was talking about in the session this morning, which is it's hard to get workers today, right? The whole economy is going great, space is going great. It's hard to go and recruit. So I think, there's kind of those negative pressures on it, if you will. But then on the, I think on the opposite side of that, there's a couple things that are certainly positive. One, when we had the discussion or the talk earlier today from SDA, you hear the word proliferation. Well, okay, that sounds like a good thing for us, right? I can put that word in front of my CEO and say, hey, space is, this is the good side of space coming back with a vengeance. So there is a need there. There's, it sure feels like that's going to continue and gives us a reason to find answers to some of the problems. I think the other piece on the good side of this is all the VC or venture money that's coming into the industry today. It's driving a lot of new technology. It's driving a whole new vendor base, which will support space as a whole in a very large way in the future. So I think the industrial base will get there. I think it's certainly swinging on the upswing now.
That's great.
Yeah, Mary Beth, if you don't mind, it's an important topic for us too. And Aerojet Rocketdyne is kind of a merchant supplier, so a lot of times we're in the middle as well, a supplier sometimes, a prime sometimes. But I think there's potentially some unintended consequences of where the government is headed with some of its new acquisition approaches and how that's going to affect the technology base of the industry as a whole. Moving away from this idea that the government funds technology for the good of the industry, owns that IP, and can distribute it where it makes sense based on the need within the government. Great examples for us is leveraging the shuttle activity across multiple product lines, RL10 across multiple product lines. RS-25 right now is supporting a DARPA program on XSP, a military application. But as the government's using more of these service-based acquisitions, one, those come with IP rights that basically mean whoever's bidding that owns the rights, and it also tends to produce a vertical integration approach. And so that money and that technology tends to get locked up in a vertical chain only within what that service is. So I think if there's going to be consequences long term to how technology benefits the broader community if this trend of just buying services continues, and that's a concern that we have.
Great. So Tom, I had a prepared question for you too, so you get double duty. Can you talk about propulsion technology for Mars, and is there some cross-cutting with the moon, or what do you think we should invest in a little further out?
Yeah, absolutely. And first I need to give Rommel credit. He finally figured out that the thrust goes on the bottom and the performance goes on the top of the rocket. Now he just needs to figure out that he needs liquid propulsion on the bottom. I think Michelle Rucker said it really well in her talk earlier about how we get to Mars, and it was that we don't need to start from scratch. So our view of the best way to get to Mars, and there's lots of ideas, is kind of what we call a split architecture, where we use highly efficient solar electric propulsion to pre-position cargo ahead of time, 2 years out, like that. The cargo doesn't really care about how long it takes to get there, so you pre-position it using the most efficient method. And then you follow on with crew delivery, where they do worry about how much time they're spending out in deep space using conventional propulsion. SEP right now is like I said, it's flying today. NASA's doing a lot of work to advance that technology to higher power levels. So I think that technology is really on the path there. We all know chemical propulsion is mature and can support that. And then long term, the NTP as a way to really cut the transfer time down from, 200, 300 days down to something like 140 days is significant, particularly with respect to crew health. So we absolutely see that we're on the right track for propulsion, and we don't see it as being a limiting factor.
Okay, great. And Kent, with limited budgets and lots of work in space, how can we make propulsion more affordable to enable successful missions?
Yeah, and I think there are several answers to that question, how you make propulsion more affordable. One that's been demonstrated lately is reusability. So you can reuse those pieces of propulsion that are expensive. And interestingly, for Omega, although in the space shuttle world we reused hundreds of solid rocket boosters, when we ran the business case, it turned out to be more affordable not to in that case. So another aspect of making things more affordable is actually prioritizing it, making it one of those design criteria that you have to meet. And a couple of decades ago, when I was at NASA, we really cared about the best system. And affordability wasn't nearly prioritized as highly as it is today. Today, customers care about value. They care about a product that will meet their needs, but is affordable, right? And so we're seeing a lot of emphasis on value, which I think is a great thing. And how do you get the best value? Well, first of all, this system has to be reliable and work. But to control costs, you need to look really hard at your supply chain. And in some cases, it makes sense to bring the supply chain in-house where you can really control the supply chain. In other cases, hey, that's just too expensive, right? So it doesn't make sense for us at Northrop to design an RL-10. So you go outside, the same with Dave's actuators. But for the most part on Omega, we do that manufacturing in-house. The other thing it does, because we're obviously a very large, broad customer-based company with many products, we happen to have the infrastructure in place in Utah where we build solid rocket motors for NASA, for the Air Force, for the Navy, for Missile Defense Agency, and for commercial customers. And given where we've been the last several decades, pretty much in most of our factories, we have excess capacity. So we're in a place where we can leverage the synergies, which are the people, the processes, and the infrastructure, to bring on another product for very affordable costs. So I think, it's kind of a neat place in the world. And lastly, I mentioned prioritizing, but we do prioritize, right? So we make trades where maybe a piece of manufacturing piece that you're using on your system is ideal technically, but it's expensive. And there's one that's not quite as good technically, but much, much more affordable. You figure out how to have the reliability out of your product with affordability, and you weight that when you make those trades and design the system. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank y'all. We're going to open it up to audience questions now.
Hi, thanks very much for the discussion. Dan Mazick, NASA Langley. I guess this question is to Kent. You just mentioned about, you did the numbers that showed that reusability didn't favor well. Is that germane specifically to the solid rocket motors? Or what's the rationale behind that?
So yeah, I think it's much different reusing a solid rocket motor versus reusing a liquid engine. And the way we've recovered solid rocket motors in the past are, you've got to incorporate a parachute on them, flotation. We also severed part of the nozzle so it didn't get damaged during splashdown in the water. And so on Omega, when we looked at all of that and flight rates and the complication, and it does add a bit of complication and weight and hurt your performance, it really didn't pay for itself by the time you looked at the labor. And so in the liquid world, right, you probably let Brett answer that question. So because it's a different beast.
Certainly, we've looked at it, and we believe reusability is the way to go. Obviously, we're looking at a reusable booster system. We're flying New Shepard now suborbitally to space, and first stage of our New Glenn rocket, which is 3.85 million pounds of thrust on the first stage, is also reusable and will land on a sea-based platform. I think there are two things that sort of work against each other in terms of affordability. Reusability, which allows you to reuse the hardware, but you're getting less production rate. And so as your flight rate, if your flight rate stays the same, then your production rate goes down because the engines and the systems are reusable, and that sort of counteracts the affordability advantage that you get from reusability. But I think the ultimate objective really is to get through that trough of where we're doing, small tens of launches a year, or a company is doing 10 a year itself, and move that into the upper tens and hundreds of launches a year, where reusability and affordability and rate all play into it, and you truly have operable systems.
Yeah, Al Tadros, Maxar. Along the same lines, you mentioned reliability for national security launches. I know a lot of launch systems are also looking at lower cost, large constellations or disaggregated, even government missions. Did the design of the Omega head down the path that it did specifically for a traditional kind of national security type of market, or is it also intended to address kind of the lower cost proliferation of disaggregated systems?
So actually both. And when the Air Force sent out the requirements for national security space, this follow-on phase, the requirements were, there were 9 reference missions, from fairly simple to very complicated. The size of rocket you needed varied a lot as well. But one of the requirements was your system had to be commercially viable. And basically the Air Force said, hey, we don't want to find ourselves in a monopoly situation where we're kind of the only customer. So if we're truly interested in your system, it needs to be designed to be affordable and service many more missions than just ours, the Air Force. So we did design Omega, and pretty much our intermediate version that has no strap-ons, our most affordable version, kind of hits the sweet spot on what we thought the commercial sector would want.
Let me add on to that in terms of reusability and reliability. Obviously, we believe that a reusable system is inherently more reliable because you're using the same hardware over, how it performs. If you think about an airplane, the safest airplane to fly on is the one that you just got off of, not the one that just came off of the factory floor. But along with that, the reliability is an outcome, or we're much more aligned with reliability based on a reusable system, because that first stage asset for us is a very high value asset. We need, as a company, to get that back. We cannot afford to throw it away every time. And so we are incentivized, if you will, to have the highest possible reliability, get that asset back. And that's much more in alignment with the payload customer, who really wants that to make it to orbit as well.
While I have the mic, a different question. I noticed the Omega has a 5-meter fairing. I think the New Glenn is 7-meter fairing. And I guess what drove you to the fairing sizes for each? And is there a trend or not?
Well, bigger is always better. Honestly, the 7-meter fairing for us was driven by the fact that we have a 7-meter diameter already on the core and the upper stage. We initially looked at a 5-meter fairing as our initial offering, since that was what was the largest available in the commercial market and required by the Air Force for their program. But there was nothing really stopping us from going straight to a 7-meter fairing. Having that additional volume is certainly useful for those that are not, let's say, performance mass constrained, but are really volume constrained, like the proliferated LEO systems. And so we decided to go straight to that size fairing.
Yeah, and on Omega, we designed for affordability to meet the mission, and this 5.3 meter fairing does that. We have a couple different lengths that we did. Having said that, it's been interesting the last couple of years, and really because of New Glenn and a 7-meter fairing, we're watching the customers, and the Air Force being one of them. And we see them becoming more and more interested in the larger fairing. So in fact, I think Blue may be setting a new standard. So the good news is for us with the Omega is we have a factory not far from here that manufactures fairings, and we have the capability to manufacture 7-meter fairings. So the truth is, on our heavy system, and I didn't talk about it much, intermediate flies in 21, our heavy's gonna fly in 24. this system is all about getting launched on time and being very reliable. With the Heavy, we have a few more years. We've got time and resources, including money, built in to incorporate some innovation. So we are evaluating if we in fact do have the right size fairing on the Heavy, but as of today, it's a 5.3 meter fairing. Good question.
So I'll ask one over this way. So a lot of talk about nuclear thermal hasn't been tested on the ground for some time, but we'd like to talk about it. What are the chief challenges of putting nuclear thermal propulsion on to a vehicle to Mars, maybe in the next 10 years, the next 20 years?
Number one, I'd say perception is probably the biggest challenge, and that's why I talked a bit about the low enriched uranium as I think being a key element of what's different from when this was done back in the 1960s and 70s. So I think that's going to be a key one in terms of the regulatory regime. Fundamentally, then demonstrating that the reactor, can do what it says. We, from the engine perspective, there are challenges, but it's fundamentally flowing hot hydrogen through an engine, and we know how to do that pretty well. I said, from a stage integration perspective, it integrates a lot like conventional engine, and it's hydrogen. So the other aspect is, particularly for something like a Mars mission, cryofluid management, having the hydrogen there 2 years later when you want to head back to Mars, to Earth, is another key challenge there. But I think the biggest is the perception that we can do it, and we can do it affordably. And I think that's where doing something that basically, there's a lot of talk all over the place about we need to do flight demos to show that we can do this. And I think getting to a quick flight demo that shows people this is a real technology that's not high risk is where we need to get to.
I would agree with that. I think the political will and the public opposition or possible opposition would be the biggest thing to overcome. Technically, we know we can do it.
Yeah, I'm on the solid guy, but I totally agree that it's a political challenge. And the other thing is, I think, once we kind of show the public, hey, now instead of 9 months to get a crew to Mars, it's a fraction of that. You drive the excitement and you show that, hey, if we're really going to start exploring Mars and beyond, you've got to have this kind of power source for those propulsion systems. And so I think we kind of have to lead the witness by getting them excited with the capability of what this system can do.
I just add, we talked a lot about space policy earlier today and how there might be some changes and regulations are getting lifted. So there's potential there to help from a regulatory and policy standpoint as well.
Question for Brett. You talked about reliability and flying the same booster over and over again. Well, we have a tremendous experience base with LOX hydrogen. We don't have such an experience base with LOX propane. So, or LNG.
Methane, yeah.
Methane. So how are you going to make up, where do you see the risk in the shortfall of experience with LOX natural gas?
I think fundamentally they're both hydrocarbons, kerosene and methane, both hydrocarbons. We haven't found any significant issues in all of the testing. We've done thousands of ignitions, thousands of seconds of testing. So, there are benefits in terms of no soot, no, autogenous pressurization, other things. So we haven't found any of those issues. Then it goes to the specific design of the engine, and just like every kerosene engine has its own specific design, you want to test it and test it and test it so that you get all the corners of the box figured out before you fly in that regime. We're doing the same thing with our BE4 LNG engine. I think the other thing that because we're designing it to be reusable, up to 100 missions, which is 200 starts because it restarts on the way down, we're building in a lot of margin throughout that engine. The other thing is, because of the way we've designed the flight trajectory, the ConOps, is we're not returning to launch site with the booster. We're flying downrange to a landing platform, and we're essentially going to fly the same path for the first stage every time. because it's the same vehicle, same configuration for no matter what's on top, we're flying that same path each time, which means we're hopefully flying down this, the dead center of the box in terms of performance instead of maxing it out at the corners of the box and changing it all the time. So hopefully that will also add to that additional reliability factor from the reusable side.
Well, I think that closes up this panel. Thank you all very much. We appreciate it. Let's give the panel a hand. So I have one more thing for y'all. Get my glasses so I can read them. It's terrible to get old. So first day of the Von Braun, 2019 Von Braun, we've had a tremendous day. I think it ended up with more meat in the program than we thought it was going to have. So we're really happy with that from a planning point of view. Our next event is at the Botanical Gardens tonight, and that's a reception sponsored by Lockheed Martin. And to get there, you just go there and turn there and turn there.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. Hopefully you can hear me all right. So that was it. That was the first day of the symposium. And the guy, he's right. This had a lot of good meat in it, this particular symposium. I appreciated the information that I got from it. So I'm going to go ahead and close out here for the day. Sorry about the audio issues throughout the day, but at least we're here. So good conversation in the chat, by the way, about the role Von Braun Mayer played in our space program and the sort of dubious moral framework on which our space program is built. And I really enjoyed that. And about the Soviet motors, apparently the KSP guy pointed out that, of course he would know because he's the KSP guy, that SpaceX did not use any old Soviet motors. I had read somewhere that we had some Soviet motors and that were, I think, for sale for a reasonable price. And I thought SpaceX used them, but apparently they didn't. They ended up doing their own. And yes, the Atlas rocket does use the Atlas rocket does use those motors. So I knew we used them somewhere. But anyway, I don't know if they're more efficient or not. I don't know anything about my rocket motors, but this is an interesting discussion anyway. So thanks guys for participating. So Gregorius, I promised you I would say a few things about a beginner telescope because you guys were talking about binoculars and Newtonian telescopes, things like that. So I don't know if it can happen quickly enough. I don't know how much of a delay there is in this stream between when I say things and when you can respond. But I have a couple questions. So when if you know nothing about astronomy and you want to buy something to help you enjoy it, then you can start with a lot of the free apps on your phone. You can start with Solarium. But if you want to actually get outside and go underneath the stars and look up, then it comes down to two things. You want your first experience to be a good one, which means that you don't know a lot. So you want to make it easy. You don't want to have to figure out a big complicated telescope. So whatever you do, Gregorius, don't spend a lot of money on a computer-controlled telescope. On a computer-controlled telescope that you'll have to learn and spend a lot of time just figuring out how to turn the thing on. There's polar alignment to consider. There's all kinds of other things like that. So complicated, expensive telescopes aren't really the way to start. Now, I believe it was James who had pointed out that you should get a pair of binoculars, and that's always a good place to start. They're limiting though. One look at a pair of binoculars, you know how to use them. The problem with binoculars is that you don't see a lot of very bright things in the sky. You can see the moon though very well, planets, Jupiter, Saturn, rings on Saturn. All that stuff is very nice in a pair of binoculars, but you're not going to get, really beautiful, breathtaking views like the Orion Nebula, although you can see the Orion Nebula in a pair of binoculars. So getting a pair of binoculars is easy. They're fun to use, and you can use it for other stuff like bird watching or looking at a distant rocket launch, things like that. So they're good for other things besides astronomy. And then he also was recommending, James was, that you maybe look into a small Newtonian, and that's a good idea. Something about a 4-inch diameter telescope with I don't know, don't spend more than $300 on it. You know, you can buy some really nice ones from Meade, Celestron, all the biggies, you know, that are sit on your car hood, and they're point and shoot, you point and look, and you get some good views of not only the planets, but you'll also be able to see some deep sky objects. Little Dobsonian, something like that. You know, just don't spend more than say, I don't know, $300 on your first thing. If you got money and you don't care, go to $500. But what you want to do, Gregorius, is enjoy the experience, and you also want to use whatever you buy. I can promise you, if you buy a big, complicated, expensive telescope right off the bat, you're not going to use it very much, because you're going to think, boy, it's clear out. I sure have to go out and observe. But then you look over your telescope and it's like, I don't want to set that thing up. So you're not going to go. You're going to sit inside and watch Netflix. Just trust me. I know you are, because I did. I do the same thing. I just don't want to set up a big, complicated telescope. And so unless you can have an observatory where you just walk out and start turning things on and looking up, then you know, that's fine. But you can do that when you've got money and you know that this is something you're passionate about. So my advice is, just get a pair of binoculars, or like James said, maybe a quick few $100 Dobsonian for, you know, aperture reasons. So anyway, you're in Indonesia. That's awesome. I don't know if you have a lot of clear skies where you are. One of my favorite things about going to Costa Rica, which is also near the equator, is beautiful there, but I didn't get many clear skies. So that's another reason not to spend a whole lot of money if you don't. So anyway, Gregorius has a couple things. Now, I know this sounds a little bit cheesy, but OPT, who you've heard me talk about, I work with them. They sponsor a lot of my stuff. They really are a good company. And if you buy something from them and you hate it, they'll take it back. That's one of the reasons I really like working with them. So they're not going to screw you over. If you bought something and you didn't like it, they don't care that you're in Indonesia. They'll ship to Indonesia. They'll take it back. They're one of the best companies I've ever seen with this. They just want you to be happy with looking up. And I swear to God, that sounds cheesy, but it really is true. I've known Dustin and these guys now for almost a year, and they are really great people to work with. So go to optcorp.com, I think. No affiliate, nothing. Just go and look around at what they've got. Buy something from them. If you don't like it, they'll take it back. It's that simple. And so you got nothing to lose. So that's my few words on this. Okay, guys, I'm going home. I'm going to the reception, which is starting now, but I got to pack up all this stuff. So I got to get going. We'll be back tomorrow, where we will start at about 8:30 a.m. We're going to be talking about lunar landers. Yes, lunar landers. They got a whole session on this. Thomas Zerbuchen is also going to be here. He's the Associate Administrator of the Science Mission Directorate. I bet we hear something about JWST tomorrow from him. Let's see, who else? And then we've got technologies to enable Moon to Mars space exploration. So all day tomorrow is going to be great. The thing is, the session ends at noon. So you guys in Europe are going to be seeing this primarily in the afternoon. It'll be over, all of it's going to be over by about 12 Eastern or Central Time, which will be 6 o'clock. Well, no, it'll be 5 o'clock UK time and 6 o'clock Central European time. So you guys it'll all be done by the afternoon. So if you got a job, you probably can't be here. But anyway, it's a half day session. So anyway, okay, guys. Well, ship to me in Australia, no problem. Great. That's right. Thank you, James, for saying that. Yes, they are worldwide. They don't care where you live. They will ship to you. And James, you know, I want to tell you too, since you bought something from them, they'll take it back if you got any problems with it. And if they don't, for whatever reason, if you think I'm just saying this, all you have to do is tell them, just mention it to me that you're having troubles, and I will let them know. I got a comment on a video once I did that said, you know, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting answers from OPT, and I just copied and pasted the comment to Ian, and he took care of it. I mean, so, you know, these guys just want to know. So if you have any problems with them, let them know they're a good company. I stand by them, and I wouldn't say that any other way. So buy stuff from them. It's great. And they'll ship anywhere in the world. And they're the best company that I know of with respect to telescopes. And they sell everything. Everything from the lowest of the low telescopes, they're not crap, they don't sell crap, but the cheapest, I should say, and to the highest end $20,000, $30,000 telescopes. They sell it all, and they sell to professionals. Okay, guys, talk tomorrow. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, keep looking up. And he waits until it goes away before he turns off the screens. Got to get a little song in there.